A sentencing hearing took a terrifying turn today when a convicted teenager threatened his own father in open court. Moments after the father delivered a scathing impact statement, the defendant delivered a final, chilling message. Watch.
Make your final statement.
I'm crying for the oxygen you're wasting. You are a rot in this family. I hope you rot in that cell.
You should be glad I got caught. You were next on the list.
Detective Mark Roberts stared across the metal table at 18-year-old Ryker Duncan, whose hands were still stained with traces of blood despite attempts to clean them. The Austin Police Department interrogation room cast harsh shadows across the young man's face, highlighting his vacant expression and the slight tremor in his hands. Ryker's white T-shirt was crumpled and bore faint, rusty smears that the forensic team would later match to his mother and sister. The clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m., just 7 hours after the bodies of Tara and Cynthia Duncan had been discovered in their suburban Austin home. "Ryker, I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight at your house," Detective Roberts began, his voice steady as the recording equipment captured every word. Ryker's eyes remained fixed on his hands, which lay motionless on the table except for the occasional twitch of his fingers. "Your father is at the hospital right now, in shock, and we have 2 dead bodies to account for," Roberts continued, leaning forward slightly. Ryker lifted his gaze slowly, meeting the detective's eyes with an unsettling blend of confusion and detachment. "Amy said they were trying to separate us," he mumbled, his voice barely audible in the small room. "She showed me the texts my mom sent to the university. Trying to send me away from her," Ryker continued, his speech becoming slightly more animated. "And my sister, Cynthia, was telling people Amy was crazy, that she was obsessed with me. Amy showed me everything they were doing." Detective Roberts made a note on his pad before sliding a form across the table. "Ryker, I'm going to read you your rights now, and I need you to understand that anything you say from this point forward can be used in court," he explained methodically. Ryker nodded absently, as if the gravity of his situation hadn't fully registered. "Where is Amy now?" Ryker asked suddenly, his eyes darting to the interrogation room door as if expecting her to walk through. "Amy Ecklar is also in custody and being questioned in another room," Roberts replied, observing how Ryker's body language shifted at the mention of his girlfriend. "If you're watching this, please like and subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The case we're about to explore reveals how quickly love can transform into deadly obsession when the wrong influences take hold." The interrogation continued for hours as Detective Roberts attempted to piece together the events that led to the brutal double homicide. Ryker's account emerged in fragments punctuated by long silences and occasional moments of emotional distress. "We were just supposed to talk to them, to make them understand," Ryker said, rubbing his temples. "Amy said we needed to stand up to them together, that they were the enemy. But then my mom started screaming at Amy, saying she'd ruined me," he continued, his breathing becoming more rapid. "Amy got really upset. She said, 'Now, Ryker.' And then I just..." Detective Roberts watched as Ryker broke down, his shoulders heaving with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. The detective had seen many killers in his 15 years with the Austin PD, but something about this case felt different. The boy before him seemed simultaneously present and absent, as if part of him had been hollowed out and replaced with someone else's intentions. "Ryker, we found the knife in your bedroom hidden under your mattress," Roberts stated, observing the young man's reaction carefully. "Can you tell me why you hid it there instead of getting rid of it?" Ryker looked up, confusion crossing his features. "Amy said we needed to keep it. She said it was proof of our love, that we'd crossed the line together and couldn't go back," he replied in a whisper. As the early morning light began to filter through the small window of the interrogation room, Detective Roberts felt he was getting a clearer picture of what had transpired. The relationship between Ryker Duncan and Amy Ecklar had formed just 6 months earlier at Austin Community College, where both were students. "Tell me about how you met Amy," Roberts prompted, shifting to establish a timeline of events. "It was in Psychology 101. She sat next to me and knew all the answers," Ryker recalled, a faint smile briefly crossing his face. "She said she understood me like no one else could, that we were special together," he continued, his expression turning distant again. The detective leaned back in his chair, considering his approach to the next series of questions. "Ryker, did you ever see Amy's journal or any notes she kept about your relationship?" he asked, carefully watching the young man's reaction. Ryker's eyes widened slightly, a flash of recognition crossing his face before he shook his head. "She had a notebook she wrote in all the time, but she never let me read it. She said it was her special place to plan our future together," Ryker responded. "Did Amy ever talk about feeling threatened by your mother or sister?" Detective Roberts asked, his pen poised above his notepad. "All the time. She would show me texts from her phone, screenshots of things my mom supposedly wrote about sending me away to college in another state," Ryker explained, his brow furrowing. "And she said Cynthia was spreading rumors at school that Amy was crazy and obsessed with me." The interrogation reached a critical point when Detective Roberts placed a plastic evidence bag on the table containing a blood-stained cell phone. "We found this in Amy's pocket when we arrested her," he stated flatly, watching Ryker's reaction closely. "The password, please." Ryker stared at the phone, his expression changing from confusion to something like fear. 10/14/21, he said quietly, then added, "It's the date we planned to run away together." Detective Roberts made note of the date, October 14th, 2021, just 2 weeks after the murders, before having an officer take the phone for immediate analysis. "What were you planning to do after you ran away?" Roberts asked, maintaining a conversational tone despite the gravity of what they were discussing. "Amy said we'd go to Mexico, that she had money saved and we could start a new life where no one would find us or try to separate us," Ryker answered, his voice taking on a dreamlike quality. As hour 6 of the interrogation approached, Detective Roberts decided to show Ryker photographs of the crime scene. "I need you to look at these, Ryker," he said firmly, placing the first image on the table. The photograph showed Tara Duncan's body in the kitchen, multiple stab wounds visible on her torso and defensive wounds on her hands. Ryker's face went pale, and he began to shake visibly. I don't remember doing that many times," he stammered, pushing the photograph away. "And what about this one?" Roberts asked, placing a second photograph showing Cynthia Duncan's body at the bottom of the staircase, her wounds indicating she had tried to flee. Ryker covered his face with his hands, his body rocking slightly back and forth. "Amy said Cynthia was trying to call 911. She was screaming for help," he whispered through his fingers. The final hours of the initial interrogation focused on establishing the sequence of events and Amy's role in the killings. "Walk me through exactly what happened when you and Amy arrived at the house," Detective Roberts instructed, his voice firm but not unkind. Ryker's account emerged haltingly, describing how they had entered the house using his key around 7:30 p.m. while his father was at a business dinner. Mom was cooking dinner, and Cynthia was upstairs doing homework, he began, staring at a point on the wall behind the detective. "Amy started the argument, telling my mom we knew about her plans to send me away. Mom looked confused, said she didn't know what Amy was talking about," Ryker continued, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "Then Amy pulled out the printouts of the text she said Mom had sent, and Mom said they were fake, called Amy a manipulative little psychopath, and told her to get out of the house." Detective Roberts nodded encouragingly as Ryker continued his account, each detail potentially critical to the case. "That's when Amy looked at me with this look I'd never seen before," Ryker said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She said, 'She's lying to you again, Ryker. She'll always lie. You know what we talked about. What has to happen for us to be free, he recounted, a visible shudder running through his body. I had the knife in my pocket. Amy had given it to me earlier, said I might need to protect us, Ryker admitted, tears beginning to stream down his face. When I pulled it out, Mom screamed and tried to run to the phone. But Amy grabbed her from behind, held her arms, he continued, the memory seemingly playing out before his eyes. I don't remember stabbing her. I just remember Amy saying deeper and keep going, and we're almost free. The sun had fully risen over Austin by the time Ryker described how his sister, Cynthia, had come downstairs after hearing the commotion. Cynthia saw Mom on the floor and started screaming. She ran for the stairs to get to her phone, Ryker said, his voice now monotone, as if he had detached himself from the memory. Amy yelled, "Don't let her call anyone," and I just followed her, he continued, rubbing his hands together compulsively. After it was done, Amy hugged me and said we were finally free, that no one could separate us now, Ryker concluded, his eyes vacant and red-rimmed from crying. She told me to hide the knife under my mattress because we might need it again, and then she started wiping things down with her sleeve, door handles, light switches. The interrogation concluded when Ryker's court-appointed attorney arrived at 8:30 a.m., advising his client to make no further statements. Detective Mark Roberts had what he needed, a confession that implicated both Ryker Duncan and Amy Ecklar in the premeditated murders of Tara and Cynthia Duncan. As Ryker was led away to a holding cell, Roberts noticed how the young man kept looking around, as if searching for someone. "Where's Amy?" Ryker asked the officer escorting him, his voice childlike and uncertain. "When can I see her?" Detective Roberts watched silently, knowing that the young man still didn't understand that the relationship that had led him to murder had been built on manipulation and lies. The evidence collected over the next few days would reveal the full extent of Amy Ecklar's influence over Ryker Duncan, and how a troubled romance between two college students had spiraled into one of the most disturbing cases of folie à deux Austin had ever seen. The digital forensics lab at the Austin Police Department headquarters hummed with activity as Detective Mark Roberts stood behind technician Vanessa Chen, watching as she navigated through the contents of Amy Ecklar's phone. The password Ryker had provided, 10/14/21, their planned escape date, had granted immediate access to a trove of evidence that would become central to the case against both suspects. Text messages between Ryker and Amy scrolled across the screen, dating back to their first meeting at Austin Community College, 6 months before the murders. "This is where it starts," Chen said, pointing to a message from April 3, 2021, the day after they met in Psychology 101. "Look at how quickly she escalates the relationship," she added, scrolling through dozens of messages sent over just the first week. The early texts showed a typical college romance blossoming, study date arrangements, flirtatious messages, and inside jokes. But within weeks, the tenor of Amy's communications began to shift subtly. "You're the only one who truly understands me, Ryker," read one message from late April. "I've never felt this connected to anyone before. It's like we're two halves of the same soul," read another. Detective Roberts noted how Amy's messages outnumbered Ryker's by nearly 5-1, and how she would sometimes send long streams of texts if he didn't respond within minutes. "Classic love-bombing phase," remarked Dr. Eleanor Weiss, the forensic psychologist who had been called in to consult on the case. "She's establishing an intense emotional dependency right from the start. By mid-May, Amy's texts had begun to introduce a new element, isolation from family and friends. Your mom looked at me so strangely when she picked you up yesterday. Did she say anything about me? Read one message. I noticed you talking to Sarah for a long time after class. What were you two discussing for so long? Read another. The frequency of such messages increased through June, with Amy repeatedly questioning Ryker about his interactions with others and suggesting his family and friends didn't approve of their relationship. She's systematically cutting him off from his support network, Dr. Weiss observed, making notes as they continued to review the messages, creating a narrative where it's them against the world. The digital evidence took a darker turn in early July when Amy began sending Ryker what she claimed were screenshots of texts and emails from his mother to various universities. "Look what I found when your mom left her phone on the counter," one message read, accompanied by a supposed screenshot showing Tara Duncan writing to an admissions counselor, "My son needs to get away from a toxic relationship. How quickly could he transfer to your school?" Detective Roberts instructed Chen to isolate these screenshots for further analysis. "We need to determine if these are authentic or fabricated," he said, though his experienced eye already recognized signs of manipulation in the images. The font doesn't quite match the standard iPhone messaging system, and there are pixelation issues around the text, Chen confirmed, flagging the images for more detailed forensic examination. By August, Amy's manipulation had intensified, with messages now regularly referencing Ryker's sister Cynthia as an active threat to their relationship. "Your sister was talking to her friends about me at the mall today. She called me psycho girl and said she was going to convince you to break up with me," read one text. "Cynthia told your mom about seeing us at the park. Now, your mom is calling my parents saying I'm too intense and obsessive. They're all trying to tear us apart," read another. The digital forensics team found no corresponding evidence on Cynthia's recovered phone to support these claims, suggesting Amy had fabricated these incidents. "She's creating phantom threats," Dr. Weiss explained, "manufacturing enemies to strengthen her position as his only ally." The most disturbing messages began appearing in September, just weeks before the murders. "We might need to take drastic measures if they keep trying to separate us," Amy wrote on September 7th. "Sometimes the only way to be free is to remove the people who are caging you," she texted on September 12th. The messages became increasingly explicit about Ryker's family as obstacles to their happiness, with Amy repeatedly using phrases like breaking free and escaping your prison. On September 25th, just 6 days before the murders, she sent a message that would become crucial evidence at trial. "I've been thinking about what we discussed. If we're really going to do this, it has to be when your dad isn't home. Your mom and Cynthia will be easier to convince without him there." Detective Roberts read this message several times, recognizing its deliberate ambiguity. It could be interpreted as planning a confrontation, but in the context of what followed, it clearly suggested premeditated murder. The final series of texts on the day of the murders, October 1st, 2021, revealed the immediate planning of the crime. "Your dad just posted on Facebook about his business dinner tonight. It's perfect timing," Amy wrote at 2:14 p.m. "Bring the knife I gave you. Keep it in your pocket until I give you the signal," she texted at 5:38 p.m. "Remember, once we do this, there's no going back, but we'll finally be free together," read her final message at 7:03 p.m., approximately 30 minutes before the killings began. The absence of any texts after that point aligned with Ryker's statement that Amy had taken his phone after the murders, claiming they needed to avoid using them until they fled. "She was methodically covering their tracks," Detective Roberts noted, "but clearly didn't anticipate they'd be caught before they could escape." While the text messages provided a disturbing chronology of manipulation, perhaps the most damning digital evidence came from Amy's photo gallery. Technician Chen discovered a folder labeled Evidence, containing dozens of obviously altered screenshots of conversations and emails that Amy had sent to Ryker as proof of his family's betrayal. "We've confirmed these are all fabrications," Chen explained, bringing up side-by-side comparisons showing the original images and Amy's edited versions. She used basic photo editing software to create these fake conversations. In one particularly disturbing example, Amy had taken a harmless text from Tara to a friend about college brochures and altered it to make it appear she was secretly planning to force Ryker to transfer to a school in California. The level of premeditation here is chilling, Dr. Weiss commented, reviewing the collection of falsified evidence. She was creating an alternative reality for him to inhabit. Perhaps most shocking of all the digital discoveries was a series of notes Amy had kept in her phone's memo app, titled Project Freedom. These notes detailed her strategies for isolating Ryker from his support network and convincing him his family was against them. Day 43 showed R the email from his mom to the California school. He was upset but still resisting the idea they're actively working against us. Need to escalate. Another entry read, Day 112. R mentioned his sister's suspicions about me. Perfect opportunity to flip the narrative. Told him C has been spreading rumors at school. He believes me now, completely. The most incriminating note, dated just 3 days before the murders, stated, Everything is in place. R has the knife. He's convinced they're the enemy now, just waiting for the right opportunity when D isn't home. After it's done, we'll have 2 weeks to prepare before heading to Mexico. As Detective Roberts compiled all the digital evidence for the prosecution team, the full picture of Amy Ecklar's manipulation came into sharp focus. This goes far beyond influence or coercion, he explained to prosecutor Emma Foster during their first strategy meeting. She systematically created a false reality for Ryker over 6 months, convincing him his family was actively working against him and their relationship. Foster nodded gravely, reviewing the binder of printed text messages and notes. The text message evidence shows clear premeditation on Amy's part and Ryker's willing participation despite some initial hesitation, she observed. But we also need to establish how much of her manipulation he was aware of versus how much he truly believed. The digital evidence would form the backbone of the prosecution's case, demonstrating not only the planning that went into the murders, but also the psychological manipulation that had warped Ryker's perception of reality. Later that day, Detective Roberts received a call from the forensic lab that would add another layer to the case. We've found something interesting on Ryker's laptop, the technician reported. A browser history showing he researched the Kirill Ann Fugate and Charles Starkweather case multiple times in September. The Starkweather Fugate killing spree of 1958, where 19-year-old Charles Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate, murdered 11 people, had disturbing parallels to the current case. Amy mentioned that case specifically in several texts, Roberts recalled, flipping back through his notes. She romanticized their us-against-the-world dynamic. This discovery suggested that Amy had not only manipulated Ryker through false evidence about his family, but had also intentionally modeled their relationship after notorious criminal couples, fostering a folie à deux dynamic where her delusions became his reality. The digital evidence trail painted a comprehensive picture of a relationship built on manipulation, isolation, and ultimately deadly obsession. Text messages revealed Amy's progressive isolation tactics, convincing Ryker his family was actively working against them. Falsified screenshots and fabricated conversations created evidence of betrayal where none existed. Notes in Amy's phone detailed her strategy for manipulating Ryker into viewing his family as enemies. Explicit planning messages in the days and hours before the murders demonstrated clear premeditation. Browser history showed research into similar criminal couples, suggesting Amy was deliberately fostering a Starkweather Fugate dynamic. As Detective Roberts prepared for Amy Ecklar's formal interrogation the following morning, he knew the digital evidence had already told much of the story. Now he needed to hear her version of events and confront her with the truth that had been recovered from her own phone. Amy Ecklar sat perfectly still in the interrogation room, her posture rigid, and her hands folded neatly on the table before her. At 19, she appeared younger than her age, with wide blue eyes that maintained steady contact with Detective Roberts as he entered the room with a thick folder tucked under his arm. Unlike Ryker's disheveled appearance after the murders, Amy was remarkably composed. Her light brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her jail-issued clothing unwrinkled. "Miss Ecklar, I'm Detective Mark Roberts," he began, setting up the recording equipment as he spoke. "I understand you've been read your rights and have waived your right to have an attorney present for this initial questioning. Is that correct?" Amy nodded, then quickly added, "Yes, that's correct, Detective. I want to help in any way I can." Her voice was soft and controlled, with a slight tremor that might have been interpreted as fear or nervousness. "I need to make sure you understand what happened. Ryker isn't himself right now," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "He's been struggling with anger issues for months. I tried to get him help, but he wouldn't listen." Detective Roberts kept his expression neutral as he opened his folder, revealing printouts of the text messages recovered from Amy's phone. "That's interesting, Amy, because the evidence we've gathered tells a very different story," he replied, sliding several pages across the table. "Why don't we start with these messages you sent to Ryker in the weeks leading up to the murders?" Amy's composure flickered momentarily as she glanced down at the messages, her fingers tightening against each other. "Those are being taken out of context," she said quickly, pushing the papers away slightly. "Ryker and I were role-playing. It was a fantasy game we played." Detective Roberts raised an eyebrow, making a note before continuing. "A fantasy game that involved planning the real murders of his mother and sister?" he asked pointedly. "That seems like an extraordinary coincidence, considering what actually happened on October 1st. The interrogation shifted as Detective Roberts produced more evidence, including printouts from the Project Freedom notes found on Amy's phone. "Can you explain these detailed plans for isolating Ryker from his family?" he asked, watching her reaction closely. Amy's right hand moved to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture at odds with her controlled demeanor. "Those aren't what they seem," she insisted, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "I was writing a psychological thriller for my creative writing class, using our relationship as inspiration." Detective Roberts nodded, as if considering this explanation, then produced another document. And these altered screenshots of conversations that never actually took place between Tara Duncan and various universities. Were those also for your creative writing class? Amy's carefully constructed narrative began to unravel as Detective Roberts methodically presented piece after piece of digital evidence. "I need you to understand what really happened that night," she said, suddenly changing tactics. "I went with Ryker to his house because he wanted to confront his mother about trying to send him away to school." Her eyes filled with tears that did not fall, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "When we got there, things escalated so quickly, Ryker just snapped." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I tried to stop him when he pulled out the knife, Detective. I tried to grab his arm, but he was too strong." Detective Roberts let silence fill the room for several seconds before responding. "That's not consistent with the forensic evidence, Amy," he said quietly, producing a preliminary report from the folder. "We found your fingerprints on Tara Duncan's arms, consistent with holding her from behind, not with trying to pull Ryker away." He paused, watching as Amy's expression shifted subtly. "We also found fibers from your clothing on both victims, including on Cynthia Duncan's back, suggesting you were in close proximity during both attacks." Amy's carefully maintained composure began to crack under the weight of the forensic evidence. "You don't understand what it was like," she whispered, a tear finally spilling down her cheek. "Tara was horrible to me from the moment Ryker introduced us. She called me names, told him I wasn't good enough." Detective Roberts remained silent, allowing her to continue. "And Cynthia was worse. spreading rumors about me at school, telling people I was crazy, that I was obsessed with Ryker. Her voice hardened slightly as she spoke about Ryker's sister. They were trying to control him, to keep him from being happy with me. The interrogation took a critical turn when Detective Roberts placed a final piece of evidence on the table, a printout of texts between Tara Duncan and a friend recovered from Tara's phone. "These are the actual messages that Tara sent about you and Ryker," he explained, pushing them toward Amy. "As you can see, she expressed some concern about the intensity of your relationship, but there's no mention of sending Ryker away or breaking you up." Amy stared at the messages, her expression hardening. "Those could be deleted or altered," she said, dismissively. "I know what she was really planning." Detective Roberts shook his head slowly. "Our forensic team has recovered the complete message history from Tara's phone and cloud backup. There's nothing remotely resembling the conversations you claimed were happening." As hours passed, Amy's account of the murders evolved several times, each version attempting to minimize her role. "I was scared of Ryker by then," she claimed at one point, contradicting her earlier statements about trying to stop him. "He had become obsessive, possessive. I went along with what he wanted, because I was afraid he might hurt me, too." Detective Roberts systematically countered each new narrative with evidence from their investigation. "Your journal entries and text messages show you were the one pushing the narrative of his family as enemies," he pointed out. "There's no evidence that Ryker exhibited any violent tendencies before meeting you." The most damning moment of the interrogation came when Detective Roberts revealed they had recovered Amy's physical journal from her apartment. "We found this in your bedside drawer," he said, placing a photograph of the journal on the table rather than the actual evidence. "It contains detailed entries about your plan to free him from his prison and how you would make him see his family as the enemy." Amy's eyes widened momentarily before her expression closed off completely. "I want a lawyer now," she said flatly, sitting back in her chair. "I'm not saying anything else without representation." Despite Amy's invocation of her right to counsel, the 3-hour interrogation had yielded critical insights for the investigation. Her multiple contradictory accounts of the murders undermined her credibility and her attempts to portray herself as an unwilling participant. The forensic evidence directly contradicted her claim that she had tried to stop Ryker, instead suggesting active participation in restraining at least one of the victims. Most significantly, her reaction to being confronted with evidence of her manipulation revealed a calculated individual who had methodically created a false reality for Ryker Duncan, ultimately leading to the deaths of his mother and sister. Later that day, Detective Roberts met with Prosecutor Emma Foster to discuss the interrogation results. "She's remarkably composed for someone facing murder charges," Roberts observed, handing over the interrogation transcript and video. "There's a calculated quality to her responses that's unusual for someone her age." Foster nodded as she reviewed the materials. "The shifting narrative is telling. She started with denial, moved to minimizing her role, then tried to paint herself as a victim of Ryker's supposed violent tendencies. She made several notes in the margin of the transcript. The forensic evidence of her holding Tara Duncan is going to be crucial in establishing her as an active participant rather than a bystander." The prosecution team's strategy began to take shape as they reviewed all the evidence gathered from both suspects' interrogations. "We're looking at a classic folia dos scenario," Foster remarked, referencing the psychological condition where a dominant person transfers delusional ideas to a more submissive individual. Amy created a false narrative of persecution by Ryker's family, and through isolation and manipulation, made him believe it completely. Detective Roberts agreed, adding, "The text messages show she was pushing this narrative for months, gradually escalating from 'they don't understand our love' to 'they're actively trying to separate us' to "we need to take drastic measures." Foster turned to the critical question of plea negotiations. Given the evidence of Amy's manipulation, do you think a jury would be sympathetic to a reduced charge for Ryker? She asked, considering the possibilities. Detective Roberts shook his head. He still made the choice to kill 2 people. The manipulation explains his motive, but doesn't excuse his actions. Foster nodded slowly. What about approaching Amy with a deal? Second-degree murder in exchange for testifying against Ryker? The detective considered this option carefully. She's more likely to take a deal? Her primary concern seems to be self-preservation based on how quickly she tried to shift blame during interrogation. The decision to pursue a plea deal with Amy Ecklar rather than Ryker Duncan was based on several strategic considerations. First, the evidence suggested Amy was the architect of the plan, making her testimony against Ryker particularly damning. Second, despite her manipulation, Ryker had physically committed both murders, making a first-degree murder conviction more straightforward. Finally, the prosecution believed Amy's calculated demeanor would make her a less sympathetic defendant to a jury than the clearly manipulated Ryker. Let's approach Amy's attorney with an offer, Foster decided. 15 years for second-degree murder in exchange for full testimony against Ryker. Days later, Amy Ecklar's newly retained defense attorney, Caroline Mendez, sat across from prosecutor Emma Foster in the Travis County Courthouse conference room. "My client maintains she tried to stop Ryker Duncan from committing these murders," Mendez began, her tone professional but firm. "She was caught in a dangerous situation with a violent individual." Foster allowed a moment of silence before responding. "Ms. Mendez, we both know that's not what the evidence shows," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Your client's fingerprints on the victim, her journal detailing the manipulation of Ryker, the falsified screenshot she created to turn him against his family. This isn't the profile of someone caught in a dangerous situation." The negotiation continued for hours, with Mendez gradually retreating from claims of Amy's innocence, as Foster systematically presented the overwhelming evidence against her client. "Here's what I can offer," Foster finally said. "Second-degree murder with a 15-year sentence in exchange for full and truthful testimony against Ryker Duncan." Mendez's expression revealed she recognized this as the best possible outcome given the circumstances. "My client will need time to consider this offer," she replied, though her tone suggested she would be recommending acceptance. "I'll need all discovery materials to review with her before she makes a decision." The following week, Amy Ecklar accepted the plea deal, agreeing to testify truthfully about her role in planning the murders and manipulating Ryker Duncan. In a private conference room at the Travis County Jail, she sat with her attorney reviewing the statement she would provide to the prosecution. "Remember, the deal requires complete honesty," Mendez cautioned her client. "If you're caught lying or minimizing your involvement during testimony, the deal is void." Amy nodded, her expression unreadable. "I understand what I need to do," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll tell them exactly what happened." As Amy signed the plea agreement, Detective Mark Roberts, observing through the one-way glass, wondered if even now she was calculating her next move, crafting a narrative that would fulfill the technical requirements of the plea deal while still painting herself in the most favorable light possible. The forensic examination of Amy Ecklar's journal, recovered from her apartment during the initial investigation, provided the prosecution with their most compelling evidence of premeditation and manipulation. The leather-bound notebook, filled with nearly 6 months of detailed entries, chronicled Amy's systematic efforts to isolate Ryker from his family and construct a false narrative of persecution. "The journal is essentially a roadmap of how she created this folie à deux," explained Dr. Eleanor Weiss, the forensic psychologist assigned to analyze its contents. It shows a level of calculation that's extraordinary for someone so young. The first entry, dated April 5, 2021, just days after meeting Ryker in their psychology class, already revealed Amy's obsessive tendencies. "I met someone who could be the one," the first entry began, innocuously enough. "Ryker is different from the others, more malleable, more trusting, and his family situation is perfect for what I need." The entry continued with disturbing clarity about Amy's intentions from the very beginning. His mother is the typical overprotective type, and his sister seems nosy. Both will try to interfere eventually, which will give me the opening I need. Dr. Weiss highlighted this passage in her report to the prosecution. "She's identifying potential obstacles to her control from day one," she noted. "This isn't a relationship to her, it's a project with a specific goal." Subsequent entries documented Amy's escalating manipulation tactics with clinical precision. Day 23 started the isolation phase today. Convinced R that his friend Jason was talking behind his back. He was resistant at first, but when I showed him the texts I created, he believed me completely. One connection severed. Another entry from May read, Day 45. R mentioned his mother asking questions about me. Perfect timing to begin phase 2, planted the first seed that she disapproves of our relationship. He defended me immediately, good sign that the bonding phase worked effectively. The calculated nature of these entries shocked even veteran prosecutor Emma Foster. She's literally documenting a step-by-step process of psychological manipulation, Foster remarked during a strategy meeting with her team. The journal reads like a how-to manual for creating dependency and paranoia. By midsummer, Amy's journal entries had taken on an even more disturbing tone, explicitly discussing her diagnosed borderline personality disorder and how she used it to her advantage. My therapist thinks I'm making progress with my BPD, but she has no idea how useful the condition can be when properly channeled, one July entry read. The emotional intensity that others find overwhelming is exactly what draws people like Ryker in. They mistake obsession for passion, control for care. Another entry elaborated on her previous relationships. This is attempt number 4 at creating the perfect partnership. Michael, Justin, and Eric all failed the test. They had too many strong connections, too much sense of self. Ryker is different. He's already isolated from his peers, has a strained relationship with his father, and seems desperate for someone to understand him, the perfect canvas. The most incriminating entries appeared in September when Amy began explicitly planning the murders. The suggestion phase is complete. R now fully believes his mother and sister are actively working to destroy our relationship, she wrote on September 8th. Today I introduced the concept of removing obstacles as a hypothetical. He was uncomfortable but didn't reject it outright. Progress. A week later, she documented giving Ryker the knife that would become the murder weapon. Gave R his protection today, a hunting knife from the sporting goods store, told him it was to keep us safe from those who wanted to separate us. He seemed confused about why we would need it, but accepted it. The seed is planted. These entries provided a chilling timeline of escalation that matched perfectly with the text messages recovered from both their phones. Perhaps most disturbing were Amy's references to the Starkweather Fugate case, which she had clearly studied extensively. Revisited the Starkweather case study today, Charles and Carol Ann understood what we're facing. They knew that society would never accept their bond, just as R's family will never accept ours, she wrote in late August. Their mistake was lack of planning and drawing too much attention with multiple victims. We'll be smarter, just 2, obstacles removed, then a clean escape. The journal revealed that Amy had deliberately modeled their relationship after the infamous killer couple, even as she planned to avoid their mistakes. Unlike Carol Ann, I won't claim innocence or betrayal, she wrote. R and I will be bound by blood and shared purpose, two halves of one entity, inseparable even by law. As prosecutor Emma Foster reviewed the journal with her team, the entries provided crucial insights into Amy's mental state and motives. This isn't just manipulation, it's a calculated grooming process, observed Assistant Prosecutor James Chen. She identified a vulnerable target, systematically isolated him from support networks, created false evidence of threats, and gradually normalized the idea of violence as a solution. Foster nodded, marking several passages for special attention during trial preparation. What's remarkable is how self-aware she is about her methodology, she replied. There's no evidence of psychosis or delusion here. She knew exactly what she was doing and documented it proudly. The journal also contained detailed entries about Amy's previous relationships, providing context for her statement to police about having a history of unstable relationships. Eric broke things off today, claimed I was suffocating him and creating drama with his friends, read an entry from the previous year. He'll regret abandoning me when he sees what R and I become. All the others who left will wish they had stayed. The pattern of intense, controlling relationships emerged clearly through these earlier entries, with Amy describing previous boyfriends as practice runs and learning experiences for what she termed her ultimate partnership. Dr. Weiss noted in her analysis that this progression suggested an escalating pattern of manipulative behavior that ultimately culminated in violence. In the weeks immediately preceding the murders, Amy's journal entries became increasingly explicit about her plans. October 1st might be the day. Dustin will be at a business dinner, leaving the house clear for our confrontation, she wrote 3 days before the killings. R still believes we're just going to talk to them, make them understand our relationship. He doesn't fully grasp what needs to happen, but he will when the moment comes. The final entry, dated the morning of the murders, was perhaps the most chilling. Today we break the chains. By tonight, R will be free from his prison, and there will be no turning back for either of us. In blood, we'll forge a bond that no one can break, not law, not society, not even death. This is what love looks like when it refuses to be denied. During a preliminary hearing to determine whether Ryker Duncan would be tried as an adult, a formality given his age of 18 but required by Texas procedure, the prosecution introduced several excerpts from Amy's journal to establish the nature of the manipulation that led to the crimes. Judge Harriet Torres, a veteran of the Travis County criminal court system, appeared visibly disturbed by the contents. In 23 years on the bench, I've rarely seen evidence of such calculated psychological manipulation, she remarked, after reviewing the submitted excerpts. The level of premeditation documented here is extraordinary. Ryker, seated at the defense table, appeared shocked as the journal entries were read aloud, his expression suggesting he was hearing many of Amy's private thoughts for the first time. The journal proved particularly valuable in establishing Amy's role as the architect of the murders, despite her not physically committing the stabbings. She created the conditions, provided the weapon, manufactured the motive, and was physically present during the acts, Prosecutor Foster explained to the grand jury when seeking indictments. Her own words in this journal established that without her influence, these murders would never have occurred. The grand jury unanimously returned indictments against both Amy Ecklar and Ryker Duncan for 2 counts of first-degree murder, though Amy's charges would later be reduced to second-degree murder as part of her plea agreement. Forensic psychologist Dr. Weiss completed a comprehensive analysis of the journal for the prosecution, identifying clear evidence of Amy's borderline personality disorder throughout the entries. The journal demonstrates classic BPD traits: fear of abandonment, unstable self-image, intense and unstable relationships, and impulsivity, her report stated. However, what makes this case unusual is the level of awareness Amy demonstrates about her condition and her deliberate weaponization of these traits to manipulate Ryker. Dr. Weiss noted that while borderline personality disorder is associated with emotional dysregulation and relationship difficulties, it rarely leads to homicidal behavior. What we're seeing here is BPD combined with significant antisocial personality traits, creating a dangerous combination of emotional manipulation and lack of empathy. During a pre-trial motion hearing, Amy's defense attorney attempted to suppress the journal, arguing it had been obtained without proper search protocols. The warrant for my client's apartment specified electronic devices and weapons, Caroline Mendez argued, before Judge Torres. A personal diary falls outside the scope of that warrant, Prosecutor Foster countered forcefully, citing the plain view doctrine. The journal was visible on the nightstand and clearly labeled Project Freedom, the same title as notes found in the defendant's phone, she explained. Given the context of the investigation, its evidentiary value was immediately apparent to the officers executing the warrant. Judge Torres ultimately denied the motion to suppress, ruling that the journal had been legally seized under the circumstances of the case. The journal's most significant impact came during plea negotiations with Amy Ecklar. Initially, her attorney had pushed for a manslaughter charge, arguing that Amy had not physically committed the murders. After we showed Ms. Mendez the most damning journal entries, her position shifted dramatically, Foster later explained to Detective Roberts. She recognized that a jury would view this level of manipulation and planning as potentially worse than the physical act itself. The entries transformed the negotiation, leading to Amy accepting responsibility for second-degree murder, a charge that acknowledged her role as more than an accessory while still offering a sentence significantly lighter than the death penalty Ryker would ultimately face. As the case proceeded toward trial, the journal became the centerpiece of the prosecution's theory of the case, a document that revealed not just what happened on October 1, 2021, but the months of careful manipulation that made the murders possible. In many ways, this journal tells us more about the crimes than even the confessions, Foster observed during final trial preparations. It shows us that these murders began long before the knife ever touched the victims. They began the moment Amy Ecklar decided that Ryker Duncan was the perfect vehicle for her disturbed fantasy of the ultimate romantic bond. The journal provided a rare window into the development of a folie à deux, a shared psychosis that would ultimately cost Tara and Cynthia Duncan their lives and forever change the Duncan family. The Travis County Courthouse was unnaturally quiet on the morning of the preliminary hearing as Dustin Duncan took the stand, his face drawn with grief and exhaustion. 8 weeks had passed since the murders of his wife and daughter, yet the successful business executive appeared to have aged years in that short time. Prosecutor Emma Foster approached the witness stand with measured steps, giving Dustin a moment to settle himself before beginning her questioning. "Mr. Duncan, I know this is incredibly difficult, and I appreciate your willingness to testify today," she began gently. "Could you please tell the court where you were on the evening of October 1st, 2021? Dustin gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles white against the polished wood. "I was at a business dinner with clients at Eddie V's in downtown Austin," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "It was a quarterly meeting that had been scheduled for months." Foster nodded sympathetically, then guided him through establishing the timeline of that evening. "I left the house around 6:15, kissed Tara goodbye, told Cynthia to finish her history project before watching TV," Dustin continued, each mundane detail of his last moments with his family clearly painful to recall. "Tara was making chicken parmesan. It was Cynthia's favorite." The courtroom remained silent as Foster carefully led Dustin through the events of that night, including the moment he received multiple missed calls from neighbors while his phone was silenced during dinner. "I stepped outside to check my messages around 9:30, he explained, his voice beginning to waver slightly. There were 7 missed calls and a voicemail from our neighbor Helen saying there were police cars and ambulances at our house." His testimony continued, detailing his frantic drive home, only to be stopped at a police perimeter at the end of his street. "An officer told me there had been a domestic incident and asked if I was Dustin Duncan," he recounted, his expression hardening at the memory. "When I said yes, they had a detective come to speak with me. That's when I learned my wife and daughter were dead." Foster approached the most difficult part of the testimony with careful precision. "Mr. Duncan, I need to ask you about what you saw when you were finally allowed to return to your home the following day," she said, her tone respectful of his grief. Dustin took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring, as if bracing himself physically for the memories. "The kitchen. There was blood everywhere," he began, his voice dropping so low the judge had to ask him to speak up. "They'd removed Tara's body, but you could see where she'd fallen, the outline on the floor." He paused, collecting himself before continuing. Upstairs was worse. The blood trail showed how Cynthia had tried to run, to hide in her bedroom. The preliminary hearing took a dramatic turn when Foster asked Dustin about his first contact with his son after the murders. "When did you first see Ryker following his arrest?" she inquired, transitioning to establish the defendant's state of mind. "2 days after, at his initial appearance," Dustin answered, his expression changing from grief to something harder to define. He looked confused, almost surprised to see me upset. Foster leaned forward slightly. "Did he speak to you?" Dustin nodded slowly. "He asked where Amy was. That was the first thing he said to me," he replied, disbelief still evident in his voice. Not "I'm sorry" or an explanation. He wanted to know where his girlfriend was. During cross-examination, Ryker's defense attorney, Martin Graves, attempted to establish a history of family tension before the murders. "Mr. Duncan, isn't it true that you and Ryker had a strained relationship in the months leading up to this tragedy?" Graves asked, his tone conversational. Dustin's jaw tightened visibly. "We had normal father-son disagreements, nothing unusual for a family with a teenager," he responded firmly. "Until he met Amy, Ryker was a good kid, respectful, hard-working, close to his mother and sister." Graves persisted. "But you had arguments about his future, didn't you? About college and his career path?" Dustin leaned forward in the witness box. "We discussed his future, yes. I wanted him to consider 4-year universities instead of community college, but these were discussions, not ultimatums." The defense strategy became clear as Graves continued his line of questioning. "Did you notice changes in Ryker's behavior after he began dating Amy Ecklar?" he asked, attempting to establish groundwork for their manipulation defense. "Yes," Dustin replied without hesitation. "He became withdrawn, secretive, started missing family dinners and canceling plans with friends he'd had for years." Graves nodded encouragingly. "And how did your wife, Tara, respond to this relationship?" Dustin's expression darkened. "She was concerned. Amy was intense, always texting him, showing up unannounced at our house," he explained. "Tara tried to talk to Ryker about healthy relationships, but he shut down those conversations immediately." As the preliminary hearing continued, the courtroom grew tense when Graves questioned Dustin about Cynthia's relationship with Amy. "Your daughter and Amy didn't get along, did they, Mr. Duncan?" the defense attorney pressed. Dustin shook his head firmly. "Cynthia was concerned about Amy's influence on her brother," he corrected. "She observed behaviors that worried her. How Amy would check Ryker's phone when he wasn't looking, how she'd interrupt whenever Cynthia tried to speak with him alone." Graves attempted to suggest Cynthia had been spreading rumors about Amy at school, but Dustin shut this down immediately. My daughter was not a gossip, Mr. Graves. She was a straight-A student focused on her future who loved her brother and was worried about him. The most powerful moment of Dustin's testimony came when Foster, during redirect examination, asked about his current feelings toward his son. Mr. Duncan, this is a difficult question, but the court needs to understand your perspective on Ryker now, she said gently. Dustin looked directly at his son for the first time since taking the stand. I've lost my entire family, he stated, his voice breaking slightly. Tara and Cynthia are gone forever, and the son I knew died that night too. Ryker, who had been looking down at the defense table throughout most of the testimony, raised his head at these words, his expression showing the first real emotion he'd displayed during the proceedings. Whatever that girl did to him, whatever she convinced him of, he still made a choice, Dustin continued, his gaze never leaving his son. He chose her over his family. And now, we're all paying the price. The preliminary hearing culminated in Judge Torres finding sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, with Ryker Duncan to be tried as an adult for 2 counts of first-degree murder. As the bailiff prepared to lead Ryker from the courtroom, an unexpected moment of raw emotion broke through the procedural formality. "Dad," Ryker called out, his voice sounding younger and more vulnerable than it had throughout the hearing. "Dad, please, you don't understand what happened." Dustin, who had been gathering his things to leave the witness stand, froze at the sound of his son's voice. "Amy showed me the messages. Mom was trying to send me away. Cynthia was telling lies about us," Ryker continued desperately as his attorney attempted to quiet him. "They were going to separate us. We had to do something." The courtroom fell completely silent as Dustin Duncan turned slowly to face his son. "You're dead to me," he said, each word precise and weighted. "My son would never have hurt his mother and sister, no matter what lies someone told him." Court officers moved between father and son as Ryker attempted to respond, his face contorted with confusion and distress. "But the messages, Dad, the emails," he insisted as he was led toward the side door. "She showed me proof." Dustin watched in silence as his son was escorted from the courtroom, his expression a mask of grief and finality. The exchange, lasting less than 30 seconds, would be referenced repeatedly by both prosecution and defense during the trial, a crystallization of the case's central tragedy. 2 weeks after the preliminary hearing, the prosecution and defense teams met with Judge Torres for a pretrial conference to establish parameters for the upcoming trial. "Your Honor, given Mr. Duncan's outburst at the preliminary hearing, we request that victim impact be strictly limited during the main trial proceedings," Martin Graves argued, concerned about the effect Dustin's testimony had on the jury pool. Foster countered immediately. "That moment speaks directly to the defendant's state of mind, Your Honor. His insistence about messages and emails supports our theory that he was operating under false beliefs deliberately cultivated by Amy Ecklar." Judge Torres considered both positions before ruling. "The emotional aspects of Mr. Duncan's testimony will be controlled, but his factual observations of the defendant's statements and behavior are clearly relevant and admissible." In preparation for the full trial, Dustin Duncan met with prosecutor Emma Foster and victim advocate Sophia Reyes to prepare for his formal testimony. The defense will try to establish that there was real family conflict that Amy merely exploited rather than manufactured, Foster explained during their strategy session. They'll suggest that Tara's concerns about the relationship were excessive or controlling. Dustin shook his head in frustration. "Tara was worried because she saw the warning signs before any of us," he responded firmly. "She noticed how Amy isolated Ryker, how he changed almost overnight after meeting her." Foster nodded, making notes. That's exactly what we need the jury to understand, that Amy's manipulation created conflict where very little existed before. When the trial formally began in March 2022, national media had descended on Austin, drawn by the sensational elements of the case: teenage lovers, family murder, and psychological manipulation. Court TV positioned cameras in the courtroom, broadcasting the proceedings to a fascinated public. Prosecutor Emma Foster's opening statement established the state's narrative clearly: this case is about manipulation, so sophisticated and deliberate that it led an otherwise ordinary teenager to murder his mother and sister, she told the attentive jury. You will see evidence of a calculated campaign by Amy Ecklar to convince Ryker Duncan that his family was his enemy, fabricated messages, falsified emails, and a journal documenting her step-by-step process of isolation and indoctrination. Defense attorney Martin Graves countered with an opening statement that positioned Ryker as another victim. My client was caught in the web of a master manipulator with a diagnosed personality disorder, he argued passionately. A young man with no history of violence who genuinely believed, because of carefully manufactured evidence, that his family was actively working to destroy the most important relationship in his life. Graves acknowledged Ryker's actions, but framed them as the product of Amy's manipulation. This is a tragedy with multiple victims, including a young man whose perception of reality was systematically distorted by someone he trusted completely. When Dustin Duncan took the stand on the third day of trial, the courtroom was filled to capacity. His testimony largely followed the same path as during the preliminary hearing, but with additional questions about Ryker's relationship with his mother and sister before meeting Amy. Ryker and Tara were exceptionally close, Dustin explained, family photographs displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. She supported his interest in photography, helped him apply for community college when he wasn't ready for a 4-year university. Foster gently guided him through memories of Ryker and Cynthia's relationship as well. They had the usual sibling squabbles, but they were friends, Dustin recalled, his voice steady but heavy with loss. Cynthia looked up to him, used to brag about her artistic brother to her friends. The most impactful moment of Dustin's trial testimony came when Foster asked him to identify the false messages Amy had shown Ryker as proof of his family's betrayal. This alleged email from Tara to Stanford University, "Did your wife ever apply to transfer Ryker there?" Foster asked, displaying the fabricated document on the courtroom screens. "Absolutely not," Dustin replied firmly. Tara respected Ryker's decision to start at community college. She was proud of him for taking that step. Foster continued through several fabricated texts and emails, with Dustin systematically debunking each one. "My wife never wrote this. Cynthia would never have said these things. This conversation simply never happened." Cross-examination by the defense was tense, with Graves attempting to suggest that even if the specific messages were fabricated, they reflected real tensions in the family. Wasn't Tara concerned about the intensity of Ryker's relationship with Amy? Graves pressed. Dustin didn't hesitate. She was concerned about behavioral changes in our son, his sudden secrecy, dropping longtime friends, missing family events, he clarified. Her concerns were about Ryker's well-being, not about controlling his relationship. When Graves suggested that Cynthia had expressed negative opinions about Amy to her friends at school, Dustin became visibly frustrated. "My daughter is not here to defend herself against these accusations, Mr. Graves. She can't tell you what she really said or did because she was murdered by the client you're defending." The impact of Dustin Duncan's testimony on the jury was evident in their expressions and body language. Several jurors wiped away tears during his description of finding his home transformed into a crime scene. Others visibly recoiled when he recounted Ryker's focus on Amy rather than remorse in their first post-arrest interaction. Throughout Dustin's time on the stand, Ryker alternated between staring at the table before him and watching his father with an expression that mixed confusion, anger, and grief, a complex emotional response that court observers interpreted in wildly different ways depending on their sympathies in the case. As Dustin stepped down from the witness stand after nearly 6 hours of testimony spread over 2 days, he paused momentarily beside the defense table. Ryker looked up, their eyes meeting in a charged moment that the court fell silent to witness. "I hope someday you understand what she did to you," Dustin said quietly, before turning to walk away. Ryker made no response, but tears filled his eyes for the first time since the trial began. The moment, captured by courtroom cameras and broadcast nationally, became one of the defining images of the case, a father's grief and a son's dawning realization encapsulated in a brief, devastating exchange that spoke volumes about the destruction one manipulative influence had wrought on an entire family. Prosecutor Emma Foster stood before the jury on the 6th day of trial, her posture confident, but her expression appropriately somber for the gravity of the case. "The state calls Detective Mark Roberts," she announced, initiating what would become the most technically detailed portion of the prosecution's case. Detective Roberts took the stand, his testimony beginning with establishing his qualifications and involvement in the investigation. "I was the lead detective assigned to the double homicide at the Duncan residence on October 1st, 2021, he explained, his voice clear and measured. "I conducted the initial interrogations of both Ryker Duncan and Amy Ecklar in the hours following their arrests." Foster methodically led Detective Roberts through the discovery and analysis of the text messages between Ryker and Amy, with key exchanges displayed on monitors throughout the courtroom. "Detective, could you explain what this message from Amy Ecklar to the defendant, sent on September 25th, means in the context of your investigation?" Foster asked, highlighting a text that read, "If we're really going to do this, it has to be when your dad isn't home." Roberts leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Based on our timeline and subsequent messages, this appears to be the point where the murders moved from theoretical discussion to active planning," he testified. "Note that this message comes just 6 days before the homicides and references the need for Dustin Duncan to be absent from the home." The prosecution built a meticulous case connecting the digital evidence to the physical crime. "Detective Roberts, did you find any evidence that these alleged messages from Tara Duncan about sending Ryker to a university across the country actually existed?" Foster asked, displaying several of the fabricated screenshots Amy had sent to Ryker. "No, we did not," Roberts replied firmly. "Our forensic team examined Tara Duncan's phone, computer, email accounts, and social media. There were no communications matching or even resembling these alleged messages." Foster nodded, advancing to the next exhibit. "And what did your technical analysis determine about these screenshots Amy sent to Ryker?" Roberts gestured toward the displayed image. "Our digital forensics team determined they were created using basic photo editing software. The font inconsistencies, pixel artifacts around the text, and metadata all confirm these were fabrications." The prosecution's case strengthened considerably when Foster introduced the forensic analysis of the crime scene. "Detective Roberts, please describe the blood evidence found in the Duncan kitchen and what it tells us about the positions of the individuals during the attack on Tara Duncan," she requested, displaying a diagram of the kitchen with evidence markers. Roberts referenced the diagram as he testified. "Blood spatter analysis indicates that Tara Duncan was initially attacked while facing away from her assailant, with her arms restrained," he explained. "The height and angle of the spatter on the refrigerator and cabinets is consistent with the victim being held from behind while being stabbed repeatedly from a position consistent with Ryker Duncan's height." Foster carefully established the forensic links between the physical evidence and Amy's role in the murders. Were you able to recover physical evidence of Amy Ecklar's presence and participation during the attack on Tara Duncan? She asked. Roberts nodded, referencing his case notes. We found Ms. Ecklar's fingerprints on the victim's upper arms, consistent with holding her from behind, he testified. Additionally, fibers from the sweater Ms. Ecklar was wearing that evening were recovered from the victim's clothing in a pattern consistent with close physical contact, the detective continued, explaining how similar evidence placed Amy in close proximity to Cynthia during her murder as well. The evidence suggests Ms. Ecklar was not a passive observer, but an active participant in restraining at least one victim and in close proximity during both attacks. The trial's focus shifted to Amy's journal when Foster introduced it as evidence, with Detective Roberts explaining its discovery. We found this journal in Ms. Ecklar's bedside table during the execution of our search warrant, he testified, as images of key pages were displayed for the jury. It was labeled Project Freedom on the cover, the same title used for notes we found in her phone. Foster guided Roberts through the most damning entries, including Amy's documentation of her isolation phase and her references to giving Ryker his protection, meaning the murder weapon. In your professional opinion, Detective, what does this journal tell us about the planning of these murders? Foster asked. Roberts's response was measured but decisive. It documents a calculated, months-long process of psychological manipulation specifically designed to convince Ryker Duncan that his family was actively working against him and that violence was a reasonable response. The defense cross-examination attempted to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. Detective Roberts, isn't it possible that Amy's journal entries represent fantasy rather than actual plans? Defense attorney Martin Graves suggested. Many people write fiction or hypothetical scenarios in their journals. Roberts shook his head slightly. The journal entries align precisely with text messages, witness accounts of Ryker's behavioral changes, and ultimately with the murders themselves, he countered. This isn't fictional. It's a documented plan that was executed almost exactly as written. Graves continued his strategy of minimizing the physical evidence linking Amy to the actual murders. Your forensic evidence shows Ryker Duncan's fingerprints on the murder weapon, not Amy Ecklar's, correct? He pressed. That's correct, Roberts acknowledged. His prints were the only ones on the knife. Graves leaned into this point. And the actual stab wounds were inflicted by Ryker Duncan, not Amy Ecklar? Roberts nodded. The physical evidence indicates he wielded the knife, yes. Graves looked satisfied with this admission, but Foster was prepared for redirect examination. Detective Roberts, based on all the evidence you've reviewed, who initiated the plan that resulted in these murders? She asked. Roberts's response was unequivocal. Amy Ecklar conceived, planned, and facilitated these murders, creating both the motive and opportunity through manipulation, even if she didn't physically stab the victims. The trial's focus shifted when the prosecution called Dr. Eleanor Weiss, the forensic psychologist who had analyzed the case evidence. Dr. Weiss, could you explain to the jury what folie à deux means in the context of this case? Foster began. Dr. Weiss adjusted her glasses before responding. Folie à deux, or madness of two, is a psychiatric syndrome where a delusional belief is transmitted from one individual to another, she explained. Typically, there's a dominant person who induces the delusion in a more submissive individual who otherwise might not develop such beliefs independently. Foster methodically built on this foundation. Based on your review of the evidence in this case, including text messages, journal entries, and interview transcripts, do you believe this case represents an example of folie à deux? Dr. Weiss nodded confidently. This is actually a textbook example, she testified. Amy Ecklar systematically constructed a false reality that Ryker's family was actively working to destroy their relationship, and through isolation and manipulation, convinced him this delusion was true. The evidence shows she was the primary inducer, and he was the secondary recipient of the shared delusion. The psychological testimony proved particularly damning when Dr. Weiss explained how Amy's borderline personality disorder factored into the manipulation. Individuals with BPD often experience intense fear of abandonment and may go to extreme lengths to prevent perceived rejection, she explained. In Ms. Ecklar's case, her journal shows she was aware of her diagnosis and deliberately weaponized these traits. Foster displayed a journal entry where Amy wrote about channeling her emotional intensity to create dependency. "What does this level of self-awareness tell you about Ms. Ecklar's actions?" Foster asked. Dr. Weiss's response was measured but pointed. "It indicates these weren't impulsive actions driven by uncontrolled symptoms, but rather calculated decisions to use her emotional intensity as a tool for manipulation." The comparison to the Carol Ann Fugate and Charles Starkweather case emerged as a central element of the prosecution's case when Dr. Weiss testified about Amy's journal references to the infamous killer couple. Ms. Ecklar specifically studied this case and modeled aspects of her relationship with Ryker after it, Dr. Weiss explained. Her journal contains multiple references to Starkweather and Fugate's us against the world dynamic, though she notes they would be smarter by limiting their victims and planning their escape more carefully. Foster pressed on this point. "In your professional opinion, what does this study of previous criminal couples indicate?" Dr. Weiss was direct. "It shows premeditation and an awareness that what she was planning was criminal. She was studying previous cases not to avoid their outcome, but to improve upon their methods." The defense attempted to counter Dr. Weiss's testimony by suggesting Ryker's manipulation did not absolve him of responsibility. Dr. Weiss, even under the influence of folie à deux, individuals retain some agency in their actions, correct? Graves asked during cross-examination. "Yes, that's correct," Dr. Weiss acknowledged. "The secondary individual isn't in a state of complete mind control." Graves continued along this line, and Ryker Duncan had opportunities to seek help or question the narrative Amy was creating, didn't he? Dr. Weiss gave a measured response. "Theoretically, yes, but the effectiveness of isolation in these cases shouldn't be underestimated. As Amy systematically cut him off from friends and family, his ability to seek outside perspectives was significantly diminished." The prosecution's case reached a critical point when they presented the forensic analysis of the supposedly incriminating messages from Tara and Cynthia Duncan that Amy had shown Ryker. Digital forensics expert Vanessa Chen took the stand, explaining in detail how these messages had been fabricated. Using metadata analysis and comparison with the actual devices, we can definitively state that these messages never existed, she testified, walking the jury through the technical evidence. The screenshots Amy showed Ryker were created using basic image editing software, with text added to make it appear as though his mother and sister were plotting against him. Foster carefully established the timeline of fabrications, displaying them chronologically alongside Amy's journal entries about her isolation phase and evidence creation. Ms. Chen, do the dates of these fabricated messages correspond with the manipulation strategy documented in Amy Ecklar's journal? Foster asked. Chen nodded decisively. Perfectly. Each fabricated message appears exactly when her journal indicates she planned to escalate to the next phase of isolation, she confirmed. For example, this fake email supposedly showing Tara Duncan contacting Stanford University was created the same day Amy wrote in her journal about introducing the college transfer narrative. The prosecution's technology-focused case continued with the introduction of Amy's search history, which revealed multiple searches about the Starkweather-Fugate murders, methods of psychological manipulation, and even forensic terms like fingerprint detection and blood spatter analysis. Ms. Ecklar's search history shows she researched not only how to manipulate Ryker, but also how to potentially avoid detection after the crimes, Foster explained to the jury, displaying a timeline of the searches. These searches increased in frequency and specificity in the weeks leading up to the murders. As the prosecution's case neared conclusion, Foster called Dr. Anthony Fielding, a psychiatrist specializing in adolescent psychology who had evaluated Ryker during pre-trial proceedings. Dr. Fielding, based on your evaluation of Ryker Duncan and review of the evidence in this case, what can you tell us about his psychological state at the time of the murders? Foster asked. Dr. Fielding leaned forward slightly before responding. Ryker displayed what we term induced delusional disorder. He genuinely believed the fabricated narrative that Amy had created about his family actively working to separate them, he testified. However, this induced state doesn't negate his understanding of right and wrong. He knew killing was wrong, but believed it was justified based on the false reality Amy had constructed. The defense cross-examination attempted to use Dr. Fielding's testimony to their advantage. Would you say Ryker's judgment was significantly impaired by this induced delusion? Graves asked. Yes. His ability to accurately perceive his family's intentions and actions was severely compromised, Dr. Fielding acknowledged. Graves continued, and if someone genuinely believes they're being persecuted or threatened, might they act in ways they otherwise wouldn't? Dr. Fielding gave a careful response. That's possible, yes, but I should clarify that Ryker wasn't experiencing a psychotic break or complete loss of reality testing. He maintained awareness of societal norms and legal boundaries. He simply believed he had justification to break them. As the prosecution prepared to rest its case, Foster delivered a powerful summary of the evidence presented. What we've established through witness testimony, forensic evidence, psychological expertise, and the defendant's own words is a clear narrative, she told the jury. Amy Ecklar deliberately and methodically manipulated Ryker Duncan over a period of 6 months, isolating him from support systems and creating a false reality in which his family posed a threat to their relationship. Foster paused, allowing this to sink in before continuing. She provided the motive through fabricated evidence, the means by giving him the murder weapon, and the opportunity by identifying when Dustin Duncan would be absent from the home. While Ryker Duncan physically committed these terrible acts, the evidence shows Amy Ecklar was the architect of this tragedy, a tragedy that cost Tara and Cynthia Duncan their lives and destroyed what remained of this family. The prosecution rested its case after 11 days of testimony, having presented a comprehensive picture of manipulation, delusion, and premeditated murder that left the jury with the disturbing image of how a troubled romance between two college students had spiraled into one of the most shocking family murders in Austin's recent history. Judge Torres called a 3-day recess before the defense would begin its case, giving jurors time to process the mountain of evidence and testimony they had heard. As court adjourned, national media coverage of the trial had already begun, drawing comparisons between the Duncan case and other notorious examples of manipulated violence, with legal analysts debating whether Ryker's sentence should reflect his role as both perpetrator and victim of Amy's psychological manipulation. The courtroom fell silent as Amy Ecklar took the witness stand on the 15th day of trial, her appearance markedly different from the confident young woman seen in college photographs. Dressed in a modest blue blouse and dark skirt selected by her defense team, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she presented an image of subdued contrition. As part of her plea agreement for second-degree murder with a 15-year sentence, Amy was required to testify truthfully about her role in the deaths of Tara and Cynthia Duncan. Prosecutor Emma Foster approached the witness stand with measured steps, her expression revealing nothing of the contempt she had privately expressed for Amy's calculated manipulation. "Ms. Ecklar, please state your full name for the record," Foster began, establishing the basic preliminaries. "Amy Lynn Ecklar," she replied, her voice soft but clear enough to carry through the courtroom. Foster nodded, then moved directly to establishing Amy's relationship with Ryker Duncan. "Ms. Ecklar, when and how did you meet the defendant?" Amy shifted slightly in her seat. "We met in Psychology 101 at Austin Community College in early April 2021, she responded. "We were paired for a group exercise on perception and reality." The irony of this detail was not lost on Foster, who paused briefly before continuing. "And how quickly did your relationship become romantic?" Amy glanced briefly toward Ryker before answering. "We went for coffee after class that first day. Started dating within a week," she explained. "It became serious very quickly." Foster methodically established the timeline of the relationship, having Amy confirm key dates that aligned with evidence already presented. "Ms. Ecklar, I'm going to ask you directly about the text messages recovered from your phone," Foster said, transitioning to the heart of the testimony. "Did you send messages to Ryker Duncan claiming his mother was attempting to transfer him to a university in another state?" Amy's composure wavered slightly. "Yes," she admitted, her gaze dropping to her hands. "And were those claims true?" Foster pressed. "No," Amy responded after a moment's hesitation. "I created those messages." Foster continued relentlessly. "Did you show Ryker fabricated screenshots of conversations allegedly between his sister Cynthia and her friends, claiming Cynthia was spreading rumors about you?" Again, Amy confirmed, "Yes, I did that." The testimony grew increasingly damning as Foster walked Amy through the deliberate campaign of isolation and manipulation documented in her journal. "Ms. Ecklar, this journal recovered from your apartment contains entries detailing what you called Project Freedom," Foster stated, displaying pages on the courtroom screens. "Can you confirm this is your handwriting and these are your words?" Amy swallowed visibly. "Yes, that's my journal." Foster read aloud a particularly incriminating entry. "Day 98. R is now fully isolated from his former friend group. He believes they've abandoned him based on the fake texts I showed him. Phase 1 complete." "Did you write this?" Amy's voice was barely audible as she responded, "Yes." Foster continued through a series of journal entries, having Amy confirm each one and explain its meaning to the jury. "What did you mean when you wrote, 'The suggestion phase is complete. R now fully believes his mother and sister are actively working to destroy our relationship?'" she asked. Amy's response was careful, clearly mindful of her plea agreement requiring complete honesty. "It meant I had successfully convinced Ryker that his family was trying to break us up," she explained. "I had shown him enough fabricated evidence that he no longer questioned me when I told him they were working against us." Foster pressed further. "And this entry from September, where you wrote about giving Ryker his protection, what were you referring to?" Amy hesitated before answering. "The knife," she admitted. "I bought it at a sporting goods store and gave it to him." The most critical portion of Amy's testimony addressed her direct involvement in the murders. "Ms. Ecklar, were you present in the Duncan home on the evening of October 1st, 2021, when Tara and Cynthia Duncan were killed?" Foster asked. "Yes, I was there," Amy confirmed. "Please describe for the jury exactly what happened when you and Ryker arrived at the house." Amy's account emerged in carefully constructed sentences, describing how they had entered the house around 7:30 p.m. and initiated a confrontation with Tara in the kitchen. "I started accusing her of trying to separate us by sending Ryker away to school," Amy testified. "I showed her the printouts of the messages I'd created, claiming they were hers." Foster interrupted at this point. "To be clear, you were showing Tara Duncan fabricated messages that you had created and attributed to her?" Amy nodded. Yes, Foster continued. And how did she respond? Amy's expression tightened. She called me a liar, said the messages were fake and that I was manipulating her son. Foster seized on this. So Tara Duncan correctly identified what you were doing to her son. Amy shifted uncomfortably. Yes, she admitted. She called me a manipulative psychopath and told me to get out of her house. The testimony reached its most incriminating point when Foster asked about the physical attacks. What happened next, Ms. Ecklar? Amy took a deep breath before continuing. I looked at Ryker and said, "She's lying to you again. You know what we talked about. What has to happen for us to be free?" She recounted, her voice slightly unsteady. Ryker pulled the knife from his pocket. Tara saw it and tried to run toward the phone, but She paused, visibly struggling with the admission. I grabbed her from behind. I held her arms. Foster let the admission hang in the air for a moment before asking, "You physically restrained Tara Duncan while Ryker stabbed her?" Amy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Yes. Foster continued methodically through the events of that night, having Amy describe Cynthia coming downstairs after hearing the commotion. What did you do when Cynthia appeared? She asked. I told Ryker not to let her call anyone, Amy testified. I said, don't let her get to her phone. Foster pressed for clarity. You directed Ryker to pursue his sister? Amy nodded. Yes. Foster continued. And did you follow him upstairs? Again, Amy confirmed. Yes, I followed behind him. Foster's next question was direct. Were you present when Cynthia Duncan was stabbed? Amy hesitated before answering, yes, I was in the room. Foster pursued this admission. Did you physically participate in Cynthia's murder, as you did with Tara's? Amy shook her head. No, I didn't hold her, but I was there. I didn't try to stop it. The prosecution then addressed the aftermath of the murders. What did you do immediately following the killings? Foster asked. Amy's response revealed the calculated nature of her actions, even in crisis. I told Ryker to hide the knife under his mattress. I started wiping down surfaces I had touched, door handles, light switches, countertops. Foster seized on this admission. So you were taking steps to conceal evidence? Amy nodded. Yes. Foster continued. And what was your plan after cleaning up? Amy's response aligned with evidence previously presented. We were going to wait 2 weeks, then drive to Mexico. I had been saving money and researching border crossings. Foster's questioning then turned to Amy's psychological diagnosis. Ms. Ecklar, you've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, correct? Amy confirmed this was true. When did you receive this diagnosis? Foster continued. When I was 17, after a suicide attempt following a breakup, Amy explained. Foster pressed further. Were you receiving treatment for this condition during your relationship with Ryker? Amy nodded. I was seeing a therapist monthly and was prescribed medication. Foster's follow-up was pointed. Did you share with your therapist your plans regarding the Duncan family? Amy shook her head. No, I was careful to present a stable image in therapy. The most damning portion of Amy's testimony came when Foster displayed her journal entries referencing the Starkweather-Fugate case. You wrote here about studying Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate. Why were you researching this case? She asked. Amy's response was quiet, but clear. I was fascinated by their relationship, how they were against the world together. Foster continued. You wrote that you and Ryker would be smarter than them. What did you mean by that? Amy looked down before answering. That we would plan better, not kill as many people, have a clear escape route. Foster let the gravity of this admission settle before asking, so you were consciously modeling your relationship with Ryker after notorious killers? The cross-examination by Ryker's defense attorney, Martin Graves, attempted to shift maximum culpability to Amy. Ms. Ecklar, you've admitted to orchestrating an elaborate scheme of manipulation that led directly to these murders, correct? He began. Amy nodded. Yes. Graves continued. And without your influence, do you believe Ryker would have had any motive to harm his mother and sister? Amy hesitated before answering. No, probably not. Graves pressed this advantage. In fact, prior to meeting you, Ryker had no history of violence or aggression, did he? Amy conceded, Not that I know of. Graves's strategy became clear, accepting Amy's central role while attempting to position Ryker as another of her victims. During redirect examination, Foster worked to counter this narrative. Ms. Ecklar, despite your manipulation, did Ryker Duncan physically commit these murders of his own volition? She asked. Amy's answer was careful. I didn't force him physically. I convinced him it was necessary. Foster continued. Did Ryker ever express doubt about your claims regarding his family? Amy nodded. Sometimes, early on, he would say things like, That doesn't sound like my mom, or Cynthia wouldn't do that. Foster seized this opening. And what did you do when he expressed these doubts? Amy's response revealed her methodology. I would show him more evidence, more fabricated messages or screenshots. I'd get emotional, ask why he didn't believe me, why he was taking their side against me. The final moments of Amy's testimony focused on her current understanding of her actions. Ms. Ecklar, looking back now, how do you characterize what you did to the Duncan family? Foster asked. Amy appeared to struggle with this question, her composed facade cracking slightly. I destroyed them, she finally said, her voice barely audible. I took a normal family and tore them apart because I couldn't bear the thought of losing Ryker. Foster pressed. And was that fear of losing him based on any real threat from his family? Amy shook her head slowly. No, they were concerned about the relationship, but they weren't actively trying to separate us. I invented that threat. Foster concluded with a final question. So you manipulated Ryker into killing his mother and sister to solve a problem that didn't actually exist? Amy's whispered yes echoed in the silent courtroom. As Amy stepped down from the witness stand, her testimony had accomplished the prosecution's goals, establishing her as the architect of the manipulation while still affirming Ryker's active participation and agency in the murders. The jury had heard directly from her about the fabricated evidence, the deliberate isolation tactics, and her physical participation in restraining Tara Duncan during the attack. Her admissions regarding the Starkweather Fugate research and escape plans further established premeditation. While her testimony provided support for the defense narrative of Ryker as manipulated, her acknowledgement that he had expressed doubts, which she then worked to overcome, undermined the claim that he was entirely without agency. Following Amy's testimony, the prosecution called forensic expert Dr. Lauren Phillips to directly address the physical evidence of Amy's participation. Dr. Phillips, can you explain to the jury the significance of the fingerprint evidence found on Tara Duncan's arms? Foster asked. Dr. Phillips used diagrams to illustrate her explanation. We recovered clear fingerprints matching Amy Ecklar on both of the victim's upper arms, she testified. The positioning and pressure patterns of these prints are consistent with someone standing behind the victim, gripping her arms to immobilize her. Foster continued. Could these fingerprints have been left while attempting to pull someone away, as Ms. Ecklar initially claimed in her police interview? Dr. Phillips shook her head definitively. No. The directional force indicators in the prints show pressure being applied inward and downward, consistent with restraint, not with pulling someone away from the victim. The forensic testimony continued with fiber evidence that further contradicted Amy's initial claims of trying to stop the attack. We recovered fibers from Ms. Ecklar's distinctive maroon sweater embedded in blood on the back of Cynthia Duncan's pajama top, Dr. Phillips explained, displaying microscopic images for the jury. This indicates close physical proximity during the attack, not someone standing at a distance trying to intervene. Foster built on this evidence. Based on the totality of physical evidence, what can you tell us about Ms. Ecklar's role during these attacks? Dr. Phillips was direct. The evidence indicates she was an active participant in restraining at least one victim and in close physical proximity during both attacks, consistent with participation rather than attempted intervention. As the prosecution prepared to rest its case following Amy's testimony and the supporting forensic evidence, Foster delivered a brief but powerful summation. The testimony you've heard today, directly from Amy Ecklar herself, confirms what the evidence has shown throughout this trial, she told the jury. This was not a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of a months-long campaign of manipulation and isolation, deliberately designed to convince Ryker Duncan that murdering his family was justified. Foster paused, allowing the weight of this to settle. Amy Ecklar has admitted to creating false evidence, to physically participating in Tara Duncan's murder, and to directing Ryker to pursue Cynthia. While she has accepted a measure of responsibility through her plea agreement, the evidence shows that Ryker Duncan made his own choices at each step, choosing to believe the manipulated evidence over his own family, choosing to bring a knife to a confrontation, and choosing to use that knife not once, but repeatedly against his mother and sister. The impact of Amy's testimony on Ryker was visibly profound. Throughout her time on the stand, he alternated between staring at her intently and looking down at the table before him, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and devastation as she systematically dismantled the reality she had created for him. By the time she finished testifying, confirming that the threats from his family had been entirely fabricated, Ryker appeared physically diminished in his chair, the full weight of his actions seemingly settling on him as the false justification for them crumbled under oath. This transformation did not go unnoticed by the jury, several of whom watched Ryker's reactions as closely as they listened to Amy's testimony. As court adjourned following Amy's testimony, national media coverage focused intensely on her revelations, with legal analysts debating whether her admitted manipulation might generate sympathy for Ryker among jurors, or whether her testimony had sealed his fate by establishing that he had chosen to believe her over his family despite occasional doubts. The prosecution had successfully used Amy's testimony to acknowledge her central role in the manipulation, while still maintaining Ryker's culpability for the physical acts of murder, a delicate balance that would ultimately prove decisive in the jury's deliberations about appropriate punishment for a young man who had been both perpetrator and victim in a tragedy of his own making. The 8th day of trial brought the psychological dimensions of the case into sharp focus as the defense called Dr. Miranda Chen, a renowned expert in adolescent psychology and manipulation. Taking the stand with calm authority, Dr. Chen established her credentials as a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Texas and author of several definitive studies on susceptibility to psychological influence in young adults. Defense attorney Martin Graves guided her through the foundation of her testimony. Dr. Chen, you've conducted a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Ryker Duncan and reviewed all case materials, including Amy Ecklar's journal and the text messages between them, correct? He asked. Dr. Chen nodded, adjusting her glasses. Yes, I conducted 3 separate evaluations of Mr. Duncan over a period of 6 months and reviewed all available evidence regarding the relationship dynamics. Graves methodically established the psychological concepts central to the defense case. Could you explain to the jury what makes certain individuals more susceptible to manipulation than others? He asked. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. There are several key vulnerability factors, she began, her voice clear and pedagogical. Age is significant. The adolescent brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for judgment and decision-making, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. She continued, emotional states matter tremendously. Individuals experiencing insecurity, transition, or identity formation are more vulnerable. Graves nodded encouragingly. Would you consider Ryker Duncan at age 18 and transitioning from high school to college to have been in such a vulnerable state? Dr. Chen was unequivocal. Absolutely. He was at a classic vulnerability point developmentally. The testimony delved deeper into the specific manipulation tactics evident in the case. Dr. Chen, you've identified several psychological manipulation techniques used by Amy Ecklar in this case, Graves prompted. Could you explain these to the jury? Dr. Chen methodically outlined the patterns evident in the evidence. The first technique was isolation, systematically cutting Ryker off from friends and family who might offer alternative perspectives, she explained. Second was information control, providing false information while limiting access to contradictory views. She continued through the list. Third was creation of a siege mentality, fostering a us-against-them worldview where loyalty is paramount. Fourth was intermittent reinforcement, alternating between intense affection and emotional withdrawal to create dependency. Graves displayed text message exchanges between Amy and Ryker that illustrated these techniques. This exchange where Amy writes, "No one understands our love. They all want to tear us apart," followed by, "I'm the only one who truly sees you." What technique does this demonstrate? He asked. Dr. Chen gestured toward the screen. This is classic siege mentality creation, combined with what we call love bombing, intense expressions of affection that create emotional dependency, she explained. Note how it's followed by accusations about his loyalty when he mentions a family dinner, creating anxiety that he must constantly prove his devotion. Graves continued through several more examples, with Dr. Chen identifying the specific manipulation strategies evident in each. The testimony reached a critical point when Graves introduced the concept of folie à deux. Dr. Chen, we've heard this term during the trial. Could you explain how it applies specifically to this case? He asked. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Folie à deux, or shared psychosis, occurs when a delusional belief is transmitted from a dominant individual to a more suggestible one, she explained. What makes this case textbook is the clear evidence of Amy Ecklar's systematic construction of a shared delusional reality, specifically the false belief that Ryker's family was actively working to destroy their relationship and separate them permanently. She continued, the fabricated evidence, texts, emails, screenshots, created tangible proof that reinforced this delusion each time Ryker might have questioned it. Graves directed the testimony toward the comparison with the Starkweather-Fugate case. Amy Ecklar's journal contains multiple references to Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate. Why would this historical case be significant in understanding the dynamic between Amy and Ryker? He asked. Dr. Chen's response was measured but pointed. Amy was deliberately modeling their relationship after a notorious criminal couple, even noting how they would improve on their methods, she explained. This suggests she was consciously fostering a pathological bond based on an us-against-the-world narrative. Dr. Chen continued, the critical difference is that Starkweather had a history of antisocial behavior before meeting Fugate, whereas Ryker had no history of violence before Amy's influence, making her role as the primary inducer of shared psychosis even clearer. The defense built toward its central argument through Dr. Chen's expert testimony. In your professional opinion, Dr. Chen, how did Amy Ecklar's manipulation affect Ryker Duncan's perception of reality? Graves asked. Dr. Chen's response was deliberate and precise. Through systematic isolation and fabricated evidence, she created what we term an epistemic bubble, a closed information environment where Ryker had no access to contradictory perspectives, she explained. Within this bubble, the narrative that his family was actively plotting against their relationship became his reality. The fabricated texts and emails served as evidence that reinforced this distorted reality each time doubts might have emerged. Graves continued building this narrative. And how would you characterize Ryker's mental state by the time of the murders on October 1st, 2021, he asked. Dr. Chen's assessment was clinical but empathetic. By that point, Ryker was experiencing what we call induced delusional disorder. He genuinely believed his family posed an imminent threat to his relationship with Amy, which she had positioned as his only remaining connection and source of emotional support, she testified. Importantly, this wasn't a psychotic break where he lost touch with all reality. Rather, he was operating within a carefully constructed alternative reality where his actions, while extreme, seemed justified based on the false information he believed was true. The prosecutor's cross-examination was sharp and focused, attempting to establish limits to the manipulation defense. Dr. Chen, despite this manipulation you've described, Ryker Duncan still understood that killing was wrong, correct? Emma Foster asked. Dr. Chen nodded. Yes, he maintained basic moral understanding. Foster continued. And he had moments of doubt about Amy's claims regarding his family? Again, Dr. Chen conceded. The evidence suggests he occasionally questioned her narratives. Yes. Foster pressed this advantage. So there were opportunities where he could have sought outside perspectives or verification. Dr. Chen gave a nuanced response. Theoretically, yes. But the effectiveness of isolation and emotional manipulation shouldn't be underestimated. Each time doubts emerged, Amy provided new evidence and emotional pressure that reinforced her narrative. Foster shifted to the specific comparison with the Starkweather case. You testified that unlike Starkweather, Ryker had no prior history of violence. But isn't it also true that Carol Ann Fugate, despite being manipulated by Starkweather, was still held legally responsible for her role in their crimes? She asked. Dr. Chen nodded. Yes, she was convicted, though many modern psychologists view her case as a clear example of coercive control and psychological manipulation that wasn't well understood at the time. Foster continued methodically. And despite being only 14, 4 years younger than Ryker Duncan, Fugate served 17 years in prison for her role in those murders, correct? Dr. Chen confirmed, that's correct. Her case remains controversial precisely because of the question of culpability under extreme manipulation. Following Dr. Chen's testimony, the defense called Ryker's former psychology teacher, Professor James Harrington, who had taught both Ryker and Amy in the class where they met. Could you describe your observations of these two students and their interaction? Graves asked. Professor Harrington adjusted his tie before responding. Ryker was quiet, thoughtful. What I'd call an average student who contributed when called upon but didn't seek attention, he recalled. Amy was different, extremely engaged, always volunteering answers, demonstrating an unusual grasp of psychological concepts for a first-year student. His testimony continued with observations about their developing relationship. I noticed Amy would often speak for both of them in group discussions, and Ryker seemed to defer to her interpretations. By mid-semester, I observed that she would often correct or redirect his contributions. The defense strategy came into sharper focus when they called Ryker's former friend, Jason Whitman, to testify. Jason, you and Ryker were close friends throughout high school, correct? Graves asked. The young man nodded, glancing briefly at Ryker. Yeah, since freshman year. We played basketball together, hung out most weekends. Graves continued. Did you notice changes in Ryker after he began dating Amy Ecklar? Jason's expression darkened completely. Within a month, he was canceling plans, not responding to texts. He elaborated. When I finally confronted him, he accused me of talking behind his back to other friends, said Amy had seen texts proving it. Jason shook his head in frustration. I never sent any texts like that. When I denied it, he just said Amy wouldn't lie to him. After that, he basically stopped talking to me completely. The testimony of Ryker's community college academic advisor, Dr. Melissa Rivera, further established the pattern of isolation. Ryker initially expressed interest in transferring to UT Austin after completing core requirements, she testified. But in late May, he abruptly changed his plans, saying he needed to stay close to home. Dr. Rivera described a meeting where Amy accompanied Ryker. She spoke for him throughout most of our session, interrupting whenever he began to express interest in transfer options. When I suggested meeting with Ryker alone for follow-up, she became visibly agitated, and they never scheduled another appointment. This testimony supported the defense narrative of Amy's systematic efforts to control Ryker's information environment and future plans. The psychological testimony reached its climax when the defense called Dr. Robert Feldman, a nationally recognized expert on the Starkweather-Fugate case. Dr. Feldman, you've studied and written extensively about the Starkweather-Fugate murders and the psychological dynamics between the couple, Graves began. Based on your review of this case, what parallels do you observe? Dr. Feldman, a distinguished older man with silver hair, leaned toward the microphone. The similarities are striking and clearly not coincidental, given Amy Ecklar's documented study of the case, he testified. Like Starkweather, Amy positioned herself as the protector in a hostile world. Like Fugate, Ryker was isolated from support systems and presented with a binary choice, complete loyalty to Amy or betrayal. Dr. Feldman elaborated on the comparison that had become central to understanding the case. What's particularly noteworthy is Amy's journal entries about improving on the Starkweather-Fugate model, he explained. She was consciously recreating that dynamic while attempting to avoid their mistakes, limiting the victims to those she perceived as direct threats to the relationship, and planning a more viable escape. He continued with his assessment. The critical psychological parallel is the creation of what we now term coercive control, a pattern of behavior that strips away the secondary partner's autonomy and replaces it with a distorted reality where violence becomes a logical response to perceived threats. In a strategic move, the defense had Ryker Duncan take the stand, his first public testimony since his initial police interview. Appearing significantly different from the confused young man seen in police footage, thinner with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor suggesting sleepless nights, he spoke softly but clearly as Graves established basic biographical information. Ryker, prior to meeting Amy Ecklar, had you ever been in trouble with the law? Graves asked. Ryker shook his head. No, never. Not even detention in school. Graves continued. Had you ever been violent toward anyone? Fights, threats, anything of that nature? Again, Ryker responded, No, never. I wasn't even allowed to play violent video games at home. Graves carefully guided Ryker through his relationship with Amy, establishing how their connection had rapidly intensified. She understood me in a way no one ever had, Ryker testified, his voice strengthening slightly. She said we were soulmates who recognized each other immediately. Graves displayed text messages showing Amy's intense expressions of devotion in the early relationship. How did these messages make you feel? He asked. Ryker's expression softened momentarily. Special. Chosen. Like I finally mattered to someone completely. His testimony continued, describing how Amy had gradually become his primary emotional connection. She would text constantly wanting to know where I was, who I was with. At first it felt good that someone cared that much. The testimony turned to the fabricated evidence Amy had created. When did Amy first show you messages, supposedly from your mother, about sending you away to school? Graves asked. Ryker's expression clouded. It was in July. She showed me screenshots of Mom texting someone at Stanford about emergency transfer procedures, he recalled. I was confused because Mom had supported me going to ACC. Graves continued. Did you question these messages? Ryker nodded slowly. At first, yeah. I said it didn't sound like Mom. His voice dropped slightly. Amy got really upset when I questioned it, said I was calling her a liar, that I was choosing my family over her. She cried for hours. After that, I stopped questioning things she showed me. Ryker's testimony about the night of the murders was halting and clearly painful. We went to the house to confront Mom about the transfer plans, he explained, his voice barely audible at times. Amy had printouts of all the messages and emails. She said we needed to make Mom admit what she was doing. He continued, describing the escalating argument in the kitchen. When Mom called Amy a manipulative psychopath and denied sending the messages, Amy looked at me with this intensity I'd never seen before. She said, "She's lying to you again. You know what has to happen for us to be free." Ryker's hands trembled slightly as he recounted pulling out the knife Amy had given him. Everything after that is fragmented, like watching someone else. I remember Mom trying to run and Amy grabbing her. I remember the knife going in and Amy saying deeper and keep going. Foster's cross-examination was methodical and direct, focused on establishing Ryker's agency despite the manipulation. Mr. Duncan, you've testified that you occasionally doubted Amy's claims about your family, she began. Why didn't you ever discuss these doubts directly with your mother or sister? Ryker looked down before answering. Amy said they would just lie to me, that they'd deny everything to keep us apart. Foster continued. Did you ever try to verify any of the messages Amy showed you? Ask to see the original texts on your mother's phone, for instance? Ryker shook his head. No. Amy said they were deleting evidence to cover their tracks. Foster pressed harder on the question of Ryker's responsibility. Mr. Duncan, you've acknowledged understanding that killing is wrong, correct? She asked. Yes, he replied quietly. And despite any manipulation by Amy Ecklar, you physically committed both murders, correct? Again, Ryker confirmed, yes. Foster continued. You had multiple opportunities to seek help, to question the narrative Amy was creating, or simply to walk away from the relationship, didn't you? Ryker's response was barely audible. I thought I had nowhere else to go. I thought everyone had turned against me. As the psychological testimony concluded, both prosecution and defense had presented detailed explanations of the folie à deux dynamic that had led to the murders. The prosecution acknowledged Amy's manipulation, but emphasized Ryker's ultimate agency in committing violence. The defense positioned Ryker as a victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation who had genuinely believed his family posed a threat. Dr. Chen's expert testimony had established the psychological mechanisms that made the manipulation possible, while the Starkweather-Fugate comparison provided historical context for understanding how shared delusion could lead to violence. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, the jury faced the complex task of determining how to weigh manipulation against responsibility, and whether a young man who had been both perpetrator and victim deserved the death penalty or a chance at eventual redemption. The Travis County Courthouse was filled to capacity as closing arguments began in the trial that had captivated Austin and drawn national attention. After 3 weeks of testimony, mountains of evidence, and expert analysis of the psychological manipulation that led to the brutal murders of Tara and Cynthia Duncan, both prosecution and defense prepared to make their final appeals to the jury. Defense attorney Martin Graves rose first, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the jury box. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout this trial, you've heard the term folie à deux. A shared madness between two people, he began, his voice measured and thoughtful. What you've witnessed in this courtroom is the devastating aftermath of one of the most sophisticated campaigns of psychological manipulation imaginable. Graves moved to a position where he could gesture toward Ryker, who sat at the defense table, looking diminished in his dark suit. Before meeting Amy Ecklar, Ryker Duncan was an ordinary 18-year-old with no history of violence or behavioral problems, he continued. He was close to his mother and sister, maintained friendships, and was planning his future at college. Graves paused, allowing this image to settle with the jury. 6 months later, he committed an act so unimaginable, so contrary to everything in his prior history, that we must ask ourselves, what could possibly transform a peaceful young man into someone capable of such violence? The defense closing argument methodically revisited the evidence of Amy's manipulation. The answer lies in what Dr. Chen described as an epistemic bubble, a manufactured reality created through isolation, fabricated evidence, and emotional coercion, Graves explained. Amy Ecklar didn't just influence Ryker, she systematically reconstructed his reality. He moved to the evidence display, highlighting key journal entries and text messages. Her own words document this process. Day 43, R. Still, expresses doubt about his mother's intentions, need to create more convincing evidence. This wasn't spontaneous manipulation. It was a calculated campaign documented in her own handwriting. Graves continued building his narrative, emphasizing the transformation in Ryker's perception. Through isolation from friends and family, through fabricated text messages and emails, through emotional manipulation that made questioning her claims tantamount to betrayal, Amy created a world where Ryker genuinely believed his family was actively working to destroy his one remaining connection, he argued. The experts have testified that by October 1st, Ryker was operating within an induced delusional state. He believed, based on the evidence Amy had manufactured, that his family posed an imminent threat to their relationship. The defense strategy acknowledged Ryker's actions while contextualizing them within the manipulation. We are not asking you to find Ryker Duncan not guilty, Graves stated clearly. He has acknowledged his role in these tragic deaths and will live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. He paused, making eye contact with several jurors. What we are asking is that you consider the extraordinary circumstances that led to these events, circumstances deliberately engineered by someone with a diagnosed personality disorder who studied criminal couples and documented her manipulation strategies like a military campaign. Graves moved toward his conclusion, directly addressing the question of punishment. The prosecution will seek the death penalty, asking you to end the life of a young man who was himself a victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation, he stated soberly. They will argue that despite this manipulation, Ryker bears full responsibility for his actions. Graves paused, allowing the weight of this to settle. We ask instead that you consider a sentence that acknowledges both the gravity of his actions and the extraordinary circumstances that led to them. A life sentence provides accountability while recognizing the role of manipulation in this tragedy, and offers the possibility that a young man whose mind was twisted by another might someday come to true understanding and remorse. Prosecutor Emma Foster rose next, her approach markedly different as she carried no notes and moved to stand directly before the jury. Manipulation is not mind control, she began bluntly. Throughout this trial, we've heard extensive testimony about how Amy Ecklar manipulated Ryker Duncan, isolating him from friends and family, creating false evidence, fostering dependency and distrust. She nodded acknowledgement of these facts. The state does not dispute this manipulation occurred, nor that it was calculated, systematic, and cruel. Foster paused, her expression hardening slightly. What we dispute is that this manipulation removed Ryker Duncan's capacity to choose, to distinguish right from wrong, and to act accordingly. Foster methodically dismantled the defense's portrayal of Ryker as lacking agency. Even Ryker's own testimony acknowledges moments of doubt about Amy's claims, she pointed out. Moments when he questioned whether the messages she showed him really came from his mother, whether his sister was actually spreading rumors. She moved closer to the jury. Each of these moments represented a choice point, an opportunity to seek verification, to speak directly with his family, to question the narrative being constructed. She paused for emphasis. Each time, he chose to accept Amy's explanations. He chose to believe the worst about the people who had loved and supported him his entire life. The prosecution's closing argument focused on establishing Ryker's awareness despite the manipulation. Dr. Feldman testified that even within a folie à deux dynamic, the secondary partner maintains basic reality testing and moral understanding, Foster reminded the jury. Ryker Duncan knew that killing was wrong. He knew that stabbing his mother and sister was illegal and immoral. She moved to the evidence display, highlighting text messages from the day of the murders. When Amy texted, "Bring the knife I gave you," he had a choice. When she texted, "Once we do this, there's no going back," he had a choice. When his mother denied sending the messages and called Amy manipulative, he had a choice. Foster built toward the prosecution's request for the death penalty with a careful balance of acknowledgement and accountability. The state recognizes that Amy Ecklar bears significant responsibility for these murders, she stated clearly. Her 15-year sentence reflects her role in planning and facilitating these crimes. Foster paused, her expression grave. But we must not lose sight of a fundamental truth. Amy Ecklar did not kill Tara and Cynthia Duncan. She did not hold the knife that stabbed Tara Duncan 17 times. She did not pursue Cynthia Duncan up the stairs and take her life as she pleaded for mercy. The emotional weight of Foster's argument built as she reminded the jury of the victims. Tara Duncan will never see her daughter graduate, never celebrate another anniversary with her husband, never fulfill her dreams of opening her own accounting firm, she said, her voice steady but resonant with controlled emotion. Cynthia Duncan was 16 years old, a straight-A student with college ambitions, a volunteer at the local animal shelter, a young woman whose life was just beginning to unfold. Foster paused, allowing these lives to be present in the courtroom. Their lives ended in terror and violence at the hands of someone they loved and trusted completely. Foster moved toward her conclusion, directly addressing the question before the jury. "The defense has asked you to consider Ryker Duncan's age and the manipulation he experienced," she acknowledged. "The state asked you to consider the deliberate choices he made at multiple points, to believe fabricated evidence over his family's denials, to bring a knife to what was supposedly a confrontation, to pursue his sister when she tried to escape." Foster's voice remained measured but intensified slightly. "Most importantly, we ask you to consider the lives of Tara and Cynthia Duncan, lives cut short with premeditation and deliberate cruelty." The prosecution's final appeal was direct and uncompromising. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case presents one of the clearest examples of premeditated murder imaginable," Foster stated. "The manipulation by Amy Ecklar explains the motive, but does not excuse the actions. Ryker Duncan chose to believe a 6-month relationship over the family who had loved him for 18 years. He chose to bring a knife into his family home. He chose to use that knife not once, but repeatedly." Foster paused for her final statement. "The state asks you to deliver a verdict that acknowledges these choices and their devastating consequences, a verdict of guilty of capital murder, with the appropriate sentence being death." As both attorneys returned to their tables, Judge Torres delivered detailed instructions to the jury regarding their deliberations and the specific questions they must answer to reach a verdict on both guilt and punishment. You must first determine whether the defendant is guilty of capital murder beyond a reasonable doubt, she explained. If you find him guilty, you will then consider whether special circumstances exist that warrant the death penalty rather than life imprisonment. The judge continued with specific guidance on how to weigh mitigating factors such as age and psychological manipulation against aggravating factors such as premeditation and multiple victims. The jury's deliberations lasted 4 days, an unusually long period that reflected the complexity of the case and the difficult questions of culpability under manipulation. National media camped outside the courthouse, with legal analysts debating whether Ryker's age and the documented manipulation would spare him from the death penalty. Inside the deliberation room, the 12 citizens of Travis County wrestled with questions that went beyond simple guilt or innocence, questions about agency, influence, and the appropriate punishment for someone who had been both perpetrator and victim in a tragedy of calculated psychological manipulation. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell completely silent as the foreman stood to deliver their verdict. On the charge of capital murder in the death of Tara Duncan, we find the defendant, Ryker Duncan, guilty, he announced, his voice steady but solemn. On the charge of capital murder in the death of Cynthia Duncan, we find the defendant, Ryker Duncan, guilty. Judge Torres acknowledged the verdict before addressing the second phase. Has the jury reached a decision regarding punishment? The foreman nodded. We have, Your Honor, after careful consideration of all aggravating and mitigating factors, we unanimously recommend that the defendant, Ryker Duncan, be sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs as the verdict was announced, with cameras capturing Ryker's expression as it shifted from anticipation to shock to a hollow resignation. Dustin Duncan, seated in the front row of the gallery, showed no visible reaction, his face a mask of grief that had long since moved beyond the capacity for further expression. As the judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the formal sentencing hearing, Ryker was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his gaze fixed on the floor before him, a young man whose manipulation-fueled choices had cost him not only his family, but now his own future as well. The Travis County Courthouse was subdued on the morning of the formal sentencing hearing, 3 weeks after the jury had returned their verdict, finding Ryker Duncan guilty of capital murder and recommending the death penalty. Security was heightened for what would be the final act in a trial that had captivated Austin and drawn national attention to questions of manipulation, responsibility, and appropriate punishment. Judge Harriet Torres entered the courtroom promptly at 9:12 a.m., her expression grave as she took her seat at the bench. The court will now proceed with formal sentencing in the case of the state of Texas versus Ryker Duncan, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Ryker sat at the defense table beside his attorney, Martin Graves, his appearance markedly different from the confused young man first seen in police interrogation videos. 5 months in custody had left him thinner, his posture more hunched, his eyes holding a haunted quality that suggested the full reality of his actions, and their consequences had finally penetrated the bubble of manipulation that Amy Ecklar had created. As required by Texas law, Judge Torres asked if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. Graves leaned over to confer with his client, who nodded slowly before rising to his feet. Yes, Your Honor, Ryker responded, his voice barely audible, until he cleared his throat and tried again. I would like to speak. The courtroom fell completely silent as Ryker turned slightly to face the gallery where his father sat in the front row. Dad, he began, his voice breaking on the single syllable, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. He paused, visibly struggling to maintain composure. For a long time, I believed what Amy showed me, that Mom and Cynthia were trying to separate us, that they were lying and plotting against us. His hands gripped the edge of the table as he continued. I see now that the only lies were Amy's. Mom and Cynthia never did any of the things she claimed. Tears began streaming down Ryker's face as he continued, making no effort to wipe them away. I chose to believe someone I'd known for months over the people who had loved me my entire life. I can never take that back or make it right. Ryker's statement continued, raw with emotion, but lucid in its acceptance of responsibility. I don't blame Amy for what I did, he stated, surprising many in the courtroom. She manipulated me. She lied to me. She isolated me from everyone who cared about me. But in the end, I made the choice to believe her. I made the choice to bring that knife. I made the choice to use it. He paused, his breathing unsteady. Every day I remember Mom trying to run to the phone. I remember Cynthia begging me to stop. His voice broke completely. I will live with those memories whether my sentence is death or life in prison. Either way, I deserve to pay for what I've done. As Ryker concluded his statement and returned to his seat, Judge Torres allowed a moment of silence before proceeding. "Does the victim's family wish to make a statement at this time?" she inquired. Dustin Duncan rose from his seat in the gallery, approaching the podium positioned before the bench. Unlike his son, Dustin's demeanor was composed, though the toll of the past months was evident in the deep lines etched into his face and the silver that now dominated his once dark hair. "Your Honor, I have prepared a statement," he said, placing a folded paper on the podium before him, but not immediately referring to it. 8 months ago I had a complete family, Dustin began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. A wife I had loved for 20 years, a daughter who lit up every room she entered, a son I was proud to watch grow into a young man. He paused briefly. Today they are all gone. Tara and Cynthia are in their graves, and the son I knew died the night he chose Amy Ecklar over his family. Dustin glanced briefly at Ryker before continuing. I've listened to all the testimony about manipulation and folie à deux. I understand that Amy Ecklar created a false reality for my son, that she systematically turned him against us through lies and fabricated evidence. Dustin's statement took an unexpected turn as he continued. But understanding is not forgiveness, he stated clearly. Every parent of a teenager knows that outside influences can be powerful. Every parent fears their child falling in with the wrong crowd or under the sway of someone who doesn't have their best interests at heart. His gaze returned to Ryker, more direct now. But influence is not control. Manipulation is not mind control. At multiple points, Ryker could have chosen differently, chosen to trust the family who had never given him reason to doubt their love over a girl he had known for months. The courtroom remained silent as Dustin continued, his composure never wavering. I have lost everything that mattered to me, he stated simply. My wife, my daughter, and yes, my son, though he still breathes, the person he was is gone to me. He finally glanced down at his prepared statement, then deliberately folded it and returned it to his pocket. I came here today planning to ask for the maximum sentence, to tell the court that death is the only appropriate punishment for taking 2 innocent lives. He paused, his expression shifting subtly. But standing here now, I find I cannot do that. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom at this unexpected turn. Not because I forgive, Dustin clarified immediately. I do not. Not because I believe rehabilitation is possible. I don't know if it is. He took a deep breath before continuing. But because Tara wouldn't want her son's death to be her legacy, because Cynthia, for all her youth, had more compassion in her heart than most adults I know. Dustin's voice wavered for the first time. And because executing Ryker won't bring them back or heal what's been broken. Dustin's conclusion left the courtroom in stunned silence. Your Honor, I ask the court to sentence Ryker Duncan to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, he stated. Not out of mercy, but out of respect for the values of the women he took from this world. Let him live with what he's done for decades to come. Let him wake each morning remembering their faces and knowing he can never make amends. With that, Dustin returned to his seat, not once making eye contact with Ryker, whose shoulders shook with silent sobs at the defense table. Judge Torres allowed several moments of silence before addressing the court again. The statement from the victim's family will be taken into consideration, she noted. However, under Texas law, in a capital case where the jury has recommended the death penalty, the court is bound by that recommendation, absent extraordinary legal circumstances. She turned her attention to Ryker Duncan. Will the defendant please rise for sentencing? Ryker stood shakily, supported by his attorney's hand on his arm. Judge Torres's expression remained impassive as she delivered the formal sentence. Ryker Duncan, having been found guilty of capital murder in the deaths of Tara and Cynthia Duncan, and the jury having recommended the death penalty after consideration of all aggravating and mitigating factors, it is the sentence of this court that you be remanded to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Institutional Division, where you will remain until such time as the sentence of death by lethal injection shall be carried out in accordance with the laws of the state of Texas. The judge paused before adding, Mr. Duncan, you have the right to appeal this sentence, and the court will appoint appellate counsel if you cannot afford to retain your own. As the formal proceedings concluded, an unexpected moment occurred when Amy Ecklar was brought into the courtroom for her own sentencing hearing, scheduled immediately following Ryker's. Under her plea agreement, she would receive 15 years for second-degree murder in exchange for her testimony against Ryker. The two young people whose toxic relationship had destroyed the Duncan family found themselves in the same room for the first time since their arrests 8 months earlier. Amy, appearing composed in a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, briefly made eye contact with Ryker as she was led to the defense table vacated by him moments before. Judge Torres proceeded with Amy's sentencing with brisk efficiency. Amy Lynn Ecklar, having pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder in the deaths of Tara and Cynthia Duncan, in accordance with your plea agreement with the District Attorney's Office, it is the sentence of this court that you be committed to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Institutional Division for a term of 15 years. The judge added, you will be eligible for parole consideration after serving at least half of your sentence in accordance with state law. Before court was adjourned, Dustin Duncan approached the bench with an unusual request. Your Honor, I would like permission to address Amy Ecklar directly, he stated. After conferring with both the prosecution and defense, Judge Torres granted the request, though she cautioned. This is irregular, Mr. Duncan. I will permit a brief statement only. Dustin nodded his understanding before turning to face Amy, who remained seated at the defense table, her expression unreadable. Amy, Dustin began, his voice controlled, but carrying the weight of immeasurable grief. In 15 years or less, you will walk free. You will still be young enough to build a life, to have a family if you choose, to pursue whatever dreams you might have. He paused, his gaze unwavering. My wife and daughter will still be dead. My son will still be on death row. And I will still be alone with the knowledge that you orchestrated all of this. Amy's composure flickered slightly, though she maintained eye contact as Dustin continued. I want you to know that when you are released, when you try to build that new life, I will be there, not to harm you, I'm not like you, but to ensure that everyone you meet knows exactly who you are and what you've done. Dustin's final words to Amy were delivered with quiet intensity. You manipulated my son into destroying our family, and now you'll serve less time than it took to raise him, he stated. That's the plea deal you made, and there's nothing I can do about it. But remember this, while you're counting down the days to your freedom, I'll be counting them, too. And when you walk out of prison, you will find that some consequences can't be negotiated away. With that, he turned and walked from the courtroom, his back straight, despite the burden he carried. In the months following the sentencing, the case continued to generate national discussion about manipulation, responsibility, and justice. Legal analysts debated the disparity between Ryker's death sentence and Amy's 15-year term, with many arguing that as the architect of the manipulation that led to the murders, she deserved the harsher punishment. Mental health professionals used the case to highlight the dangers of folie à deux and the vulnerability of young adults to psychological manipulation. Victim advocates pointed to Tara and Cynthia Duncan as the often forgotten center of the tragedy. 2 lives ended brutally by someone they loved and trusted. Ryker Duncan's case entered the lengthy appeals process typical of death penalty cases in Texas, with his attorneys arguing that his age and the documented psychological manipulation should have been given greater weight as mitigating factors. Amy Ecklar, meanwhile, began serving her sentence at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, where she reportedly adapted quickly to prison life and enrolled in psychology courses offered through the prison education program, a detail that struck many as darkly ironic given how she had weaponized her understanding of psychology to manipulate Ryker. Dustin Duncan sold the family home in Austin, unable to continue living where his wife and daughter had been murdered. He established a foundation in their names focused on educating young people about psychological manipulation and healthy relationships. In interviews, he spoke candidly about the warning signs he and Tara had missed in Ryker's relationship with Amy: the isolation from friends and family, the sudden secretiveness, the personality changes that, in retrospect, signaled the effectiveness of her manipulation. If sharing our tragedy prevents even one family from experiencing what we did, he told a national news program, then perhaps some meaning can be found in this senseless loss. The case of Ryker Duncan and Amy Ecklar became a landmark in the study of folie à deux and manipulated violence, cited in psychology textbooks and legal journals as an example of how a skilled manipulator can transform an otherwise nonviolent individual into an instrument of destruction. It raised difficult questions about culpability, appropriate punishment, and the limits of the legal system in addressing the complex psychological dynamics that can lead to violence. Most significantly, it served as a sobering reminder that while manipulation can explain actions, society still holds individuals accountable for their choices, a principle reflected in Ryker's own final statement to the court. She manipulated me, she lied to me, she isolated me, but in the end, I made the choice. As Ryker began the long journey through the appeals process that would likely keep him on death row for decades to come, and Amy began counting down the days until her potential parole, the Duncan family tragedy stood as a haunting example of how quickly and completely a family could be destroyed, not by an outside intruder or a long-simmering internal conflict, but by a calculated campaign of manipulation that turned a son against the very people who had loved him unconditionally from the moment of his birth. In the words of Judge Torres at the conclusion of the sentencing hearings, "This case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous threats come not from strangers, but from those we have welcomed into our lives and hearts. And the greatest tragedy is not just the lives lost, but the perversion of love into its deadly opposite,